The sea has always been a place of mystery, a shifting boundary between the known and the unknown. But in the older stories of humankind, it is not merely a border. It is a thief, a destroyer, a devourer of worlds. Imagine, for a moment, standing on the edge of a great and radiant city thousands of years ago. Marble temples glisten in the light of a fading sun. Columns rise toward the heavens, engraved with symbols no longer understood. Ships filled with treasures wait at the harbors, their sails spread wide like wings of white linen. Priests chant in high towers, their voices carried across the wind as offerings of gods who have watched over the city for generations. And then, without warning, the sky darkens. The ground trembles. The ocean itself rises up as if alive. Walls of water roar higher and higher until they shatter the coast, rushing inward, drowning everything. Screams mix with thunder. Temples collapse. Fires sputter as they meet the tide. In a single night, a civilization is swallowed whole, leaving behind silence. This is the story of Atlantis, or at least how it is remembered. For over 2 millennia, the tale of Atlantis has lingered in human imagination like a shadow. It was Plato, the philosopher of Athens, who gave this story its first shape. He spoke of a civilization advanced beyond any of its neighbors, powerful in wisdom and wealth, yet corrupted by arrogance. The gods, he said, punished them with fire and water. Whether it was allegory or fact, his words etched an image into history, a world lost beneath the waves, a civilization erased in a single cataclysm. And yet, as with all legends, what captures us most is not only the story of destruction but the mystery of survival. If Atlantis was real, if it was more than philosophy or myth, then surely something of it endured. Stones crumble, but knowledge is a way of slipping past the wreckage of time. And knowledge, especially when pressed into charts, diagrams, or maps, has the power to survive even when empires do not. Maps are more than mere guides. They are records of memory, imagination, and ambition. A line across parchment can represent centuries of travel. A coastline drawn with careful ink can preserve the experience of sailors long dead. And in some cases, maps can preserve something even older, echoes of civilizations erased from the physical world. What if Atlantis, in its final hours, left behind not only survivors but fragments of its wisdom? What if its cartographers, its priests, or its explorers carried charts of lands across seas, knowledge of coastlines beyond their time, and buried them into the archives of younger civilizations? If such maps existed, then perhaps Atlantis has never truly been lost. Perhaps it has always been hiding in plain sight. The idea is not new. Throughout history, whispers have surfaced of maps that should not exist, charts that depict lands not yet discovered, coastlines not yet surveyed, even continents buried beneath ice. Scholars, explorers, and skeptics have argued over these anomalies for centuries. Were they luck, accident, or fraud? Or were they remnants of something far older than we dare to admit? Each mysterious map is a riddle, a puzzle piece hinting at an older master copy. And if there was such a master copy, where did it come from? The answer, some insist, is Atlantis. Consider how civilization survived catastrophe. Refugees carry their stories, their rituals, their languages. A people may lose their homes, their temples, their armies, but they cling to what they know. Knowledge is light against the darkness of ruin. If Atlantis fell, it is not unreasonable to imagine that survivors carried their charts across the seas. Some might have found refuge in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, or along the coast of the Mediterranean. Others might have wandered further still, leaving behind fragments that would resurface centuries later in libraries, monasteries, and sailors' logs. Over time, these fragments would be copied, reinterpreted, and disguised. They would pass through Phoenician traders, Greek scholars, Arab navigators, and medieval mapmakers, until at last they emerged in strange places, in Ottoman palaces, Renaissance workshops, and dusty archives. To most eyes they looked like ordinary maps. To a careful reader, they seemed impossible. This is where the story of Atlantis becomes more than a myth. It becomes a question, not only of whether Atlantis existed, but whether its knowledge has guided us all along. Did explorers who discovered new lands truly stumble upon them? Or did they already carry charts, copies of older maps, guiding them across oceans long before their age of discovery? The thought unsettles our understanding of history. It suggests we have been chasing echoes, following paths laid down thousands of years earlier by hands we do not recognize. Picture again that night of destruction, the city crumbling, the ocean swallowing streets of stone. Among the chaos, imagine a small group, navigators clutching scrolls and charts, priests protecting records of stars and coastlines, scholars guarding the geometry of their world. They flee into darkness, their destination unknown. But their maps survive. They pass from generation to generation, sometimes hidden, sometimes revealed. Each time they resurface, they appear anachronistic, filled with details that should not exist. They are fragments of a vanished world, traces of Atlantis whispering through parchment. And so, the story begins not with ruins at the bottom of the sea, but with maps in human hands. Maps that seem to carry a secret too vast to ignore. This is a mystery we will explore, the hidden cartographic inheritance of Atlantis. Were these maps guiding ancient explorers? Were they warnings or invitations? Or are they simply shadows, illusions crafted by coincidence and imagination? The journey ahead will take us from Plato's words to forgotten libraries, from medieval phantom islands to the icy edges of Antarctica. Each step will bring us closer to an unsettling possibility that Atlantis, though swallowed by the sea, has never truly disappeared. It has been guiding us all along. In the grand halls of ancient Athens, a man sat with the weight of entire civilizations in his words. His name was Plato, a philosopher who spoke not merely of logic and ethics, but of the soul of humanity itself. Around him, disciples leaned forward, listening to tales that blurred the line between memory and myth. Among his many dialogues, two stood out, Timaeus and Critias, where Plato whispered of a world older than Greece, older than Egypt, a world swallowed by catastrophe. He called it Atlantis. Plato did not speak of it as a poet inventing a fable, nor as a storyteller weaving allegory. He gave details, startlingly specific details. Atlantis, he said, lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. It was larger than Libya and Asia combined, a great island kingdom that commanded both the seas and the lands. Its people were mighty, skilled in engineering, masters of agriculture, and builders of temples that reached toward the sky. They possessed canals, irrigation systems, and harbors more advanced than anything known in Plato's world. This was no vague fantasy. This was a blueprint of a civilization. Where, then, did Plato learn this? He claimed the story was not his own but inherited from the Egyptians. Solon, a great Athenian lawmaker who had traveled to Egypt, was told by priests of Sais that the Greeks remembered only one flood, but there had been many. Among them, they said, was the destruction of a great island civilization that had grown too proud, too powerful, too corrupt. The gods struck it down, and in a single day and night of misfortune, it was gone. Solon returned to Athens with this tale, but it was Plato who immortalized it. He transformed Egyptian memory into Greek philosophy, embedding Atlantis not only into myth but into the architecture of Western thought. But Plato's account has always troubled historians. If it was merely allegory, a cautionary tale of hubris and downfall, why anchor it with such vivid geography? Why describe harbors, rings of canals, and exact measurement of walls and temples? He even provided the timeline. Atlantis fell 9,000 years before Solon. To Plato's contemporaries, that would have placed Atlantis thousands of years before the dawn of Greek civilization, at the very edges of human memory. Such precision unsettles a myth. Myths rarely give dates. Myths rarely draw maps. Plato did. For centuries, scholars debated his intent. Some claimed Atlantis was an ideal, a parable to warn Athens not to repeat its mistakes. Others suggested it was history disguised as philosophy. Yet beneath the arguments lies an enduring question. Was Plato remembering, or was he preserving? Was Atlantis a story crafted by his imagination, or was it a fragment of ancient memory, passed down through cultures, reaching back into a time so distant we struggle to conceive of it? If Atlantis was real, its knowledge could not have vanished overnight. Great civilizations leave echoes. They leave broken pottery, collapsed walls, forgotten languages. But they also leave something more enduring, memory hidden in stories, encoded in symbols, preserved in charts. And in Plato's words, some researchers believe we find not only allegory but direction, clues pointing toward geography long forgotten. He mentioned the great ocean beyond the known world, a landmass larger than any in the Mediterranean. To modern eyes, it is difficult not to imagine the Atlantic itself, or perhaps even the Americas, lying far across the sea. Did Plato, through Solon and the Egyptian priests, hold a memory of lands no Greek had yet seen? This possibility grows more haunting when we consider the Egyptians themselves. Their civilization was ancient even in Plato's time, their record stretching back thousands of years. What if their priests were not inventing tales for Solon, but recalling fragments of older knowledge, records preserved from survivors of Atlantis itself? Egypt's pyramids, its geometry, its astronomical alignments, could these too be the echoes of a greater, older inheritance? And if so, was Plato's retelling less invention and more revelation, a subtle attempt to encode the memory of a lost world into the heart of philosophy? The beauty and the danger of Plato's account lies in its ambiguity. It is both specific and elusive, specific enough to tempt explorers, yet elusive enough to frustrate them. Many who came after tried to trace his words onto real geography. Was Atlantis a continent swallowed by the Atlantic? Was it the volcanic island of Santorini, where the Minoan civilization collapsed in fire and ash? Or was it somewhere entirely different, an unknown land remembered only in fragments of story and map? Each theory begins with Plato, with the way his words linger, like an echo bouncing through history. What makes his testimony most intriguing is not what he said, but what he might have left unsaid. Plato was no fool. He was a master of allegory, but also a man aware of the limits of speech in dangerous times. Could it be that his dialogues contained hidden layers, veiled references, codes that only the initiated would understand? If so, perhaps Atlantis was not only a warning against pride, but a veiled record of real knowledge. Knowledge too fragile to state plainly, yet too important to let die. Across centuries, readers return to Plato's words with fresh eyes. Renaissance thinkers searched them for geographical clues. Enlightenment scholars dismissed them as myth. In the 19th century, writers like Ignatius Donnelly proclaimed Atlantis as the mother civilization of the world. Each age reinterpreted Plato according to its hunger. But through it all, one truth remained. No one has ever erased his words. His echo survives, and in that echo lies the seed of the mystery we now chase. If Atlantis truly existed, then Plato was its first mapmaker, not of coastlines or harbors, but of memory itself. His dialogues sketch a world not on parchment, but in the imagination, compelling generations to search beyond the horizon. His words may have been philosophy, but they functioned as coordinates. They pointed outward, across the pillars of Heracles, into the vast Atlantic where maps would one day reveal anomalies, impossibilities, and secrets. The story of Atlantis, then, does not begin with explorers setting sail or with maps drawn in secret chambers. It begins here, with Plato's echo, a voice from antiquity that still calls to us across time. Whether fact, allegory, or a mixture of both, it planted in humanity an irresistible question. What if there was once a civilization more advanced, more expansive, and more mysterious than our histories admit? A civilization that left behind not monuments, but maps? And so, the search began, not only for ruins, but for evidence hidden in the folds of parchment, in the silent accuracy of charts, in the impossible details of coastlines drawn long before their discovery. Plato's words opened the door. What lay beyond it will become one of the greatest mysteries of human history. Imagine walking through the great library of Alexandria at its height. Marble pillars stretch skyward, sunlight spilling across endless rows of papyrus scrolls stacked in niches and chambers. The air is thick with the smell of ink and aged parchment. Scholars from every corner of the known world whisper among themselves, carrying accents from Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and even lands further east. This was not just a library, it was a beating heart of human knowledge, a place where every scrap of wisdom was gathered, catalogued, and guarded. Legends claim that ships arriving at Alexandria were required to surrender their scrolls, which were then copied by scribes. The originals remained in the library, while copies returned to their owners. In this way, Alexandria was less a library and more an empire of memory. If any place could have safeguarded fragments of Atlantis, it was here. Among the millions of scrolls stored in its halls were records of lands beyond the Mediterranean, astronomical charts from Babylon, mathematical treatises from India, and, some whispered, even stranger works whose origins could not be traced. Imagine for a moment that in those chambers lay a parchment older than Egypt itself, a chart drawn not in Greek or hieroglyphs, but in symbols now lost, sketching coastlines far across the Atlantic. We do not know for certain what secrets the library held, for its treasures have been scattered or destroyed, but hints survive. Ancient writers spoke of mysterious maps in Egyptian archives, maps that suggested knowledge of the Atlantic Ocean long before Columbus. Could these have been Atlantean fragments, carefully preserved by priests and eventually deposited in Alexandria's vaults? Egyptian priests, after all, were the very source Plato claimed for his tale of Atlantis. Solon, the lawgiver, heard the story in Sais, an Egyptian city where temples held records far older than Greece itself. If those priests preserved such knowledge, it is natural to think copies found their way to the Library of Alexandria. Perhaps they were tucked between astronomical scrolls, disguised as myth, or locked away in restricted chambers. The library, after all, was divided. Some works were accessible to scholars, while others were guarded as state secrets. It is here, in the quiet corners of forbidden shelves, that the whispers of Atlantis may have waited, silent and unseen. But the tragedy of Alexandria is that we will never know the full extent of its holdings. Fires, invasions, and neglect over centuries turned much of its knowledge to ash. Julius Caesar's troops are said to have burned part of it in 48 BCE. Later, during the decline of the Roman Empire, further damage was inflicted. By the time the final blow came, whether under Christian or Islamic rulers, the great library was a shadow of its former self. And yet, fragments survived. Scholars carried copies elsewhere. Certain texts reappeared in Byzantine monasteries, in Arabic translations, in Renaissance collections. The question lingers, what was lost and what was saved in silence. Some researchers believe that the idea of lands beyond the ocean, preserved in myths like those of Atlantis, may have been kept alive through these hidden archives. When Arab geographers later described islands in the Atlantic, phantom lands like Antillia or Al-Maghrib, they may have been echoing scraps of knowledge once stored in Alexandria. When medieval sailors traced coastlines with uncanny accuracy, perhaps they drew on copies of maps whose originals had perished in the flames. In this sense, Alexandria may not have been the end of Atlantean memory, but a conduit, a place where fragments were absorbed, copied, and quietly transmitted across generations. Think of it like a river. Atlantis may have been the source, but Alexandria became a delta, breaking the knowledge into countless streams. Some flowed into Arabic scholarship, some into Greek philosophy, some into European map-making centuries later. Each stream seemed insignificant on its own, but when compared, they reveal a pattern, details that should not exist, knowledge centuries ahead of its time. The whispers of Atlantis may have been carried not by monuments or ruins, but by ink, parchment, and patient scribes who never realized the true origin of what they preserved. And there's one more layer to the mystery: secrecy. Not everything in the library was intended for public use. Ancient rulers understood the power of knowledge. A map was not just geography, it was power over trade, navigation, and empire. If any scroll revealed knowledge of distant lands, it may have been locked away deliberately. Perhaps only a handful of priests or royal scholars were allowed to see it. And so, the whispers of Atlantis were not silenced by time alone, but by design. Knowledge was hoarded, guarded, and in some cases erased to prevent rival powers from using it. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria has often been described as humanity's greatest intellectual tragedy. But perhaps its greatest tragedy was not only what was burned, but what was hidden, knowledge that slipped into obscurity, passed hand to hand in secrecy, until it resurfaced in fragments centuries later. When we look at impossible maps like the Piri Reis chart, we are not only staring at anomalies. We may be seeing the faint glow of a fire that once burned brightly in Alexandria's halls. And so, when we speak of Atlantis, we cannot forget this library. It may never give up its full secrets, yet its shadow still hangs over history. For if Plato's story came from Egypt, and if Egypt's records found their way into Alexandria, then perhaps the knowledge of Atlantis was never entirely lost. Perhaps it was whispered in scrolls that outlived the flames, guiding navigators, explorers, and dreamers long after the city itself sank into silence. Long before the so-called Age of Discovery, there were whispers that the world was already known, at least to a chosen few. The seas of antiquity were not empty voids waiting for daring men to cross them. They were highways, traveled by merchants, fishermen, and empires whose names we only half remember. And along those hidden highways, maps may have existed, charts that should not have been possible in their time. These were not the maps carved neatly into stone tablets for the education of kings, but fragile parchments passed hand to hand, jealously guarded, often destroyed. They were forbidden not because they were evil, but because they revealed too much. To understand their mystery, we must begin with the Phoenicians, the great seafarers of the Mediterranean. Long before the Greeks rose to prominence, Phoenician ships crisscrossed the seas, venturing into the Atlantic through the Strait of Gibraltar. Ancient accounts tell us they reached as far as Britain, seeking tin from Cornwall and perhaps even beyond. Their knowledge of coastlines and winds would have been invaluable, and it is said they recorded their journeys. But those charts were never shared with outsiders. Carthage, the Phoenician colony that became a rival to Rome, treated navigation secrets as matters of national security. There are legends of Carthaginian captains deliberately wrecking their own ships to prevent foreigners from following their routes. If maps of the Atlantic existed, they were locked away, kept in guarded archives where only a handful of elite navigators could see them. This secrecy fuels the first question. Did these maps include knowledge passed down from even earlier civilizations? The Phoenicians were inheritors as much as innovators. They traded not only good but ideas, absorbing wisdom from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and perhaps from survivors of older worlds. If fragments of Atlantean charts survived, the Phoenicians may have been the first to carry them into the Atlantic again. But because their maps were hoarded, the wider world never saw them, at least not directly. Greek writers hint at this hidden knowledge. Herodotus, often called the father of history, wrote of Phoenician sailors who circumnavigated Africa under orders of the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II around 600 BCE. If true, this voyage required remarkable navigational skill and knowledge of coastlines thousands of miles long. How could they accomplish such feats without detailed records? And yet, curiously, we have no surviving Phoenician maps, only whispers of what they might have known. Then there's a tale of Piri Reis of Map, a Greek explorer who lived in the 4th century BCE. He claimed to have sailed far north, reaching a land he called Thule, where the sea turned to a strange mixture of ice and water. His account was doubted for centuries, yet modern scholars recognize his description as the Arctic regions. Did Piri rely on his own exploration alone, or did he possess fragments of older charts that guided him toward lands the Greeks barely imagined? If so, those maps, too, have vanished, leaving us only with echoes in his writings. Rome, too, inherited and suppressed secrets. As the Republic expanded into an empire, it absorbed Carthaginian territories and their archives. The Romans were excellent engineers, but their seafaring reputation was weaker. They relied heavily on the charts of others, yet those maps rarely appear in Roman records. Why? Some suggest that Rome, like Carthage, considered maritime knowledge too valuable to release. Navigation meant control over trade, supply lines, and conquest. To publish accurate maps of the Atlantic or beyond would have meant giving away power. And so, the knowledge was hoarded, forbidden not by religious law but by politics and empire. But fragments leaked through. Ancient geographers, from Strabo to Ptolemy, sometimes mention lands or coastlines that seem anachronistic. Ptolemy's world map, compiled in the 2nd century CE, became a foundation for medieval cartography. Yet scholars have long puzzled over oddities in his coordinates, details suggesting sources far older than his era. Where did he obtain this information? Perhaps from scrolls copied and recopied since the days of Phoenician or Egyptian archives. Perhaps from whispers that had survived all the way from Atlantis. What makes the forbidden charts most haunting is not only what they may have contained, but how they vanished. Knowledge leaves scars when it is deliberately erased. We see traces of this erasure in fragmented accounts of islands that no longer exist, coastlines drawn centuries before official discovery, and myths of lands beyond the horizon. When these fragments re-emerge in the Middle Ages, often attached to maps filled with both fantasy and precision, they carry the feel of something ancient, too old, too accurate to belong. And always, there's a pattern: secrecy, suppression, disappearance. It is as though someone, or some group, understood that these maps were dangerous. Dangerous because they proved the world was larger than people believed. Dangerous because they suggested history stretched further back than accepted. Dangerous because they hinted that humanity was not the first to map the globe. The maps were forbidden because they pointed to Atlantis, whether explicitly or not. So we stand at a cliff edge of history. We cannot hold these maps in our hands, but their ghostly presence lingers in writings, legends, and anomalies that refuse to vanish. From Phoenician secrecy to Greek explorations, from Roman control to the silence of vanished archives, the forbidden charts of antiquity whisper the same question. What was hidden, and why? Were they fragments of Atlantean knowledge, carefully hoarded by empires who knew their value? Or were they suppressed precisely because they revealed a truth too explosive to admit, that humanity's first great mapmakers belonged not to Greece, Rome, or Egypt, but to a civilization now buried beneath the sea? The answers, if they ever existed, are lost to time, but their shadows prepare us for what is to come. Maps that did survive, maps that should not exist, maps so precise they defy explanation. If the forbidden charts of antiquity have vanished, the next stage of our journey leads us to those impossible survivors, the maps that reach across centuries to whisper the voice of Atlantis more clearly than ever before. In the vaults of Topkapi Palace, Istanbul, lies a fragment of parchment that should not exist. It is torn, incomplete, and faded with age, yet the moment it was rediscovered in 1929, it ignited a storm of questions that remain unanswered to this day. This was a map of Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral, navigator, and cartographer who lived in the early 16th century. But what stunned the world was not merely the beauty of his work, it was what the map appeared to reveal. Drawn in 1513, barely 2 decades after Columbus first reached the Americas, the Piri Reis Map depicted coastlines no European should have known at the time, and perhaps even more unsettling, coastlines no one should have known at all. The fragment shows the western coast of Europe and Africa with striking accuracy. That alone would have been expected, given the centuries of Mediterranean trade and exploration. But then, further west, the parchment reveals something far stranger, a depiction of the Americas. Not only the Caribbean islands, which Columbus had already stumbled upon, but also stretches of the South American coast rendered with precision far beyond what explorers of the early 1500s could possibly have charted. This was troubling enough, but the greatest shock lay further south, for there, at the edge of the map, appears to be a coastline resembling Antarctica. Here lies the enigma. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, over 300 years later. And even then, explorers saw only its ice-covered shores. Yet the Piri Reis Map seems to show not just the outline of Antarctica, but Antarctica as it might have appeared free of ice, revealing mountain ranges and contis invisible beneath the frozen sheet that has covered the continent for millennia. How could such knowledge exist on a map drawn in 1513? Piri Reis himself offered a tantalizing clue. In the notes written on the margins of his map, he explained that he had not charted these lands from first-hand experience. Instead, he claimed to have compiled his map from about 20 older sources, including chart from the time of Alexander the Great, Arab navigators, and even maps captured from Christopher Columbus. In other words, the admiral was not an originator but a curator, gathering fragments of ancient knowledge and stitching them into a single image. This confession raises more questions than it answers. If his map truly reflects older sources, then where did those earlier charts come from? Who had drawn the Americas, and who had mapped Antarctica long before modern discovery? The possibility that Antarctica's ice-free coastline was once known challenges not only history but geology. Studies suggest that Antarctica has been buried beneath ice for at least 6,000 years. To draw it without ice, one would need either advanced technology, such as aerial surveys or sonar mapping, or knowledge passed down from a time when Antarctica was not yet frozen. Either explanation points to a civilization far older and more advanced than any officially recognized. Skeptics argue, of course, that the resemblance is coincidence. They claim that what some see as Antarctica might instead be a distorted continuation of South America, stretched by the difficulties of transferring a spherical world onto flat parchment. But the detail with which the coastline is rendered, and the curious way it aligns with modern seismic surveys of Antarctica's subglacial features, makes coincidence harder to swallow. The more one looks at the lines, the more deliberate they seem. And so the debate rages. Was Piri Reis's map a miracle of chance, a jumble of guesses that accidentally resemble reality? Or was it the echo of a knowledge chain stretching back into prehistory? For believers in ancient civilizations, the Piri Reis Map is a smoking gun, a relic of Atlantean cartography that somehow survived into the Ottoman age. But the mystery deepens when one considers the timing. The early 1500s were an era of fierce secrecy. The Spanish and Portuguese empires guarded their navigational charts with near-religious zeal. Maps were power to claim new lands, to control trade routes, to dominate seas. Piri Reis, as an admiral of the Ottoman fleet, would have had every reason to gather intelligence. That he had access to Columbus's captured charts is plausible. That he also had sources from the time of Alexander is harder to explain. Were these ancient maps preserved in hidden archives, passed down through Arab scholars during the golden age of Islamic science, and ultimately compiled by the Ottomans? Or were they fragments so ancient that no one truly remembered their origin? If Piri Reis's sources were genuinely ancient, then they provide a possible link in the chain, from Atlantis to Egypt, from Egypt to Greece, from Greece to the Arab world, and from there into Ottoman hands. Along that path, maps could have been copied, mistranslated, and altered, yet still carried within them the ghostly outline of knowledge humanity should not yet possess. For centuries, the Piri Reis Map has been studied, tested, and debated. Military analysts in the 20th century reportedly examined it with interest, noting how certain features aligned with modern surveys. Authors and researchers of alternative history seize on it as evidence of lost civilizations. Traditional historians counter with dismissals, emphasizing errors and distortions in the map. And yet the enigma persists because the anomalies refuse to vanish. The Americas appear too well-formed, too early. Antarctica appears too detailed, too impossible. There is also something poetic about the survival of the Piri Reis Map. It exists only as a fragment, torn from a larger chart whose rest has been lost. What did the missing sections reveal? Did they contain even more unsettling coastlines, perhaps hints of lands now vanished? The absence of the rest of the map makes it more tantalizing, as though history has granted us only a partial glimpse of forbidden knowledge, just enough to ignite questions but not enough to resolve them. And so the Piri Reis Map stands as one of the most enduring mysteries of cartography. It is at once an Ottoman artifact, a Renaissance curiosity, and a possible key to an ancient world we have forgotten. Whether it is evidence of Atlantean knowledge passed down through millennia, or merely an extraordinary collage of the best chart available in 1513, it has carved its place into the mythology of lost civilizations. The parchment whispers that humanity once knew more than we admit, and that somewhere, buried in archives or beneath the sea, other fragments may wait to be found. The enigma of Piri Reis is not that he drew what he saw, but that he drew what he should not have known. And in that impossible knowledge lies the shadow of Atlantis. In 1531, a French mathematician and cartographer named Oronteus Finaeus, Latinized as Oronteus Finaeus, unveiled a map that would perplex generations of scholars and explorers. At first glance, it resembled the ambitious works of Renaissance cartography, bold, imaginative, and eager to capture the expanding horizons of the known world. But upon closer inspection, this map concealed a mystery far stranger than the era's usual geographical guesses. For drawn prominently along its southern edge was a vast landmass, one that looked eerily like Antarctica. The strangeness of this detail becomes apparent when we recall that Antarctica would not be officially sighted for almost 3 centuries. Even then, explorers only glimpsed its frozen fringes, not the detailed contours of its vast interior. Yet in Phineus's rendering, the southern continent is not only present. It is depicted with rivers, mountain ranges, and a remarkably accurate outline, as though its creator had access to data centuries beyond his time. How could a Renaissance scholar, sitting in France, have charted the hidden continent at the bottom of the globe? The story of the map's discovery adds another layer of intrigue. In the 20th century, scholars examining old collections stumbled upon Phineus's work and were struck by its anomalies. Here was not a crude sketch or vague mythological land. It bore striking similarities to modern projections of Antarctica, minus the ice. Even more uncanny, the features he drew aligned with what scientists would later confirm through seismic surveys, revealing mountain ranges and river valleys buried deep beneath the continent's frozen cloak. One interpretation is almost too fantastic to consider, that Phineus had access to ancient maps, themselves copied from even older originals, dating back to an age when Antarctica was not yet smothered by ice. If this is true, then those maps must have been drawn at least 6,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, during a time when human civilization, at least as we recognize it, was supposedly still in its infancy. Could this be evidence that an advanced culture, maybe even Atlantis itself, once charted the Earth with precision lost in millennia? Supporters of this theory point out the uncanny precision of Phineus's work. He not only draws Antarctica in approximately the right size and shape, but he also situates it in the correct position relative to Africa and South America. For a man working in 1531, without satellites or even reliable longitude measurements, this accuracy seems impossible. Some researchers suggest he may have inherited fragments of knowledge preserved in monastic libraries, ancient archives, or even documents passed down in secrecy through scholarly networks. Others go further, imagining direct survival of Atlantean science, preserved in whispers and relics until it reached Renaissance Europe. Skeptics, however, argue for caution. They note that Renaissance cartographers often invented southern continents as a matter of symmetry, filling blank spaces on the globe with imagined lands to balance the northern hemispheres. Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, was a common feature on many maps of the time. To them, Phineus's Antarctica is no more than an embellished guess, a speculative landmass inserted to satisfy aesthetic and philosophical notions of balance. The rivers and mountains, they argue, are simply the creative flourishes of a cartographer who liked to populate blank spaces with detail. But if it were only guesswork, why does it so closely match what modern science has since confirmed? Why do its contours align with Antarctica's hidden geography, rather than being wildly inaccurate like so many other Renaissance guesses? Coincidence can explain much, but the degree of similarity continues to nag at historians, geologists, and alternative theorists alike. Adding to the mystery is a cultural moment in which Phineus lived. The early 1500s were a period of explosive exploration. European powers were desperate to outmaneuver each other with new trade routes and hidden knowledge. Cartographers were at once artists, scientists, and spies, tasked with turning fragments of rumor, secret voyages, and ancient lore into visual form. It is entirely possible that Phineus stumbled across a scrap of older knowledge, a copy of a copy, perhaps mislabeled or misunderstood, that guided his hand in ways he himself did not fully comprehend. He might have believed he was merely sketching the theoretical southern land, never realizing he was echoing something real. There is also the haunting possibility of deliberate concealment. If ancient knowledge survived into the Renaissance, it may not have been widely shared. The guardians of such secrets, whether church officials, royal courts, or hidden societies, would have had every incentive to keep them closely guarded. Maps were not only scientific tools, they were instruments of power. A map that revealed coastlines unknown to the world could mean the difference between empire and oblivion. Perhaps Phineus's map is not merely an anomaly but a trace, an accidental leak of a knowledge base deliberately hidden from the wider public. The more one studies a map, the more questions it raises. Why does its depiction of Antarctica suggest an ice-free coastline, a condition not seen in recorded human history? Why does it contain features that modern instruments only rediscovered in the last century? Why did no one in Phineus's time seem to recognize the significance of what he had drawn? It is as if the map was a message left in plain sight, its meaning invisible until humanity caught up centuries later. Some researchers argue that the Phineus map forms part of a chain, a series of echoes stretching from the Piri Reis Map through Arab and Greek sources back into the deep mists of prehistory. In this chain, the Renaissance cartographers are not inventors but translators, unwittingly preserving fragments of forgotten epoch. If this is true, then the Phineus map may not be a curiosity at all, but a crucial clue in humanity's missing history. Whether we see it as coincidence, speculation, or a genuine relic of lost knowledge, the Oronteus Finaeus map occupies a space where skepticism and wonder collide. Its rivers and mountains whisper of a time when Antarctica was not an ice desert but a habitable land, perhaps even home to ancient voyagers. Its existence challenges us to ask whether our picture of the past is truly complete, or whether pieces of the puzzle still lie scattered, waiting to be recognized. For now, the Phineus map sits quietly in the archives, its ink faded but its mystery undimmed. Like the frozen continent it depicts, it is a silent witness to secrets the earth has long buried. Whether it is a work of imagination or a shard of Atlantean memory, it continues to provoke the same haunting question. What did we once know, and why did we forget? Beneath the golden sands of Egypt lies a silence that has haunted human imagination for centuries. The Nile winds through the desert like a ribbon of life, carrying with it the memories of one of the world's most enduring civilizations. But beyond the monuments, the temples, and the hieroglyphs carved into stone, there are whispers of something older and inherited from a forgotten world. Many scholars have long suspected that Egypt's genius, its sudden rise to architectural and spiritual mastery, may not have been born in isolation. It may have been the echo of knowledge carried across oceans of time, a gift, or perhaps a survival, from a civilization that had vanished long before the first pyramids rose. The Nile itself is central to this mystery. For ancient Egyptians, the river was more than water. It was a lifeline, a calendar, and a god. Its annual floods, swelling and receding with uncanny rhythm, dictated the agricultural cycles on which the kingdom's survival depended. To harness the Nile's power, the Egyptians developed sophisticated mathematics, astronomy, and hydraulic engineering. But some researchers believe that this mastery appeared too quickly, as if the first dynasties were not starting from scratch, but rather inheriting the remnants of a far older tradition. The ancient texts of Egypt provide tantalizing clues. The so-called pyramid texts and later writings reference a mythical Zep-Tepi, the first time when gods walked the earth and imparted wisdom to humankind. To Orthodox historians, this is mythology, a way for Egyptians to frame their origins in divine terms. But to others, it hints at a cultural memory of a lost epoch, one in which survivors of a cataclysm, perhaps the sinking of Atlantis, brought their knowledge to the fertile banks of the Nile. If so, then Egypt was not the beginning of civilization, but the rebirth of one that had been drowned. One of the most striking aspects of this theory lies in Egypt's architecture. The early dynastic pyramids, particularly those on the Giza Plateau, appear to leap out of nowhere in terms of sophistication. Unlike the gradual development of stone buildings seen in other regions, the Egyptians seem to begin at the peak, constructing monuments so precise in alignment and execution that modern engineers still marvel at them. This has led some to suggest that the builders were not inventors but inheritors, drawing upon blueprints or principles preserved from an earlier, forgotten civilization. The question is, who preserved them, and how? There are also curious parallels between Egyptian myths and the broader flood legends found around the world. Stories of a great deluge appear not only in Mesopotamia's Epic of Gilgamesh in the Hebrew Bible, but also in far-flung cultures from India to the Americas. Egypt, too, preserved tales of rising waters, of chaos and rebirth. Could these be fragments of a shared global memory, all pointing to the same event, the drowning of a world like Atlantis and the scattering of its survivors? If so, the Nile may have been one of the cradles where these refugees seeded their knowledge, ensuring that at least some part of their lost world lived on. Skeptics argue that Egypt's achievements can be explained without invoking Atlantis. They point to the long period of experimentation with mud, brick, and stone, the careful evolution of burial practices, and a uniquely Egyptian worldview shaped by the river cycles. Yet even among Orthodox scholars, the speed and scale of Egypt's rise remain striking. Civilization seemed to bloom along the Nile as if overnight, already mature, already armed with astronomical precision and architectural ambition. Was this the natural flowering of genius, or revival? Another layer of intrigue lies in the Nile geography itself. Some researchers note that the river, with its mysterious sources deep in Africa and its peculiar northward flow, almost seems like a natural symbol of rebirth, carrying ancient memories toward the Mediterranean world. The Nile Delta, with its fertile expanses, may have been the perfect refuge for survivors fleeing a drowned homeland. It would have offered shelter, resources, and the opportunity to rebuild in a land both stable and strategically placed. If Atlantean voyages truly existed, Egypt would have been one of the most natural places for them to anchor. The connection between Egypt and Atlantis also appears in later traditions. The Greek philosopher Plato, whose dialogues gave us the earliest surviving account of Atlantis, claimed that his story came from Solon, who in turn had learned it from Egyptian priests at Sais. According to those priests, Atlantis had been destroyed 9,000 years earlier, swallowed by floods and fire. Egypt, they implied, was among the inheritors of Atlantis' memory, preserving the story when others had forgotten. If true, then the Egyptians themselves acknowledged their debt to a lost civilization. Even the gods of Egypt seemed to carry echoes of the drowned world. Osiris, the green-skinned lord of the underworld and resurrection, is often associated with flooding waters, rebirth, and eternal cycles. His myth revolves around death, dismemberment, and restoration, a theme hauntingly similar to the idea of a shattered civilization pieced together in fragments across the world. Was Osiris more than a myth? Was he a symbolic representation of Atlantis itself, broken and drowned, yet living on through Egypt's inheritance? The sands of Egypt still hold secrets. Beneath the Sphinx, beneath the ruins of forgotten temples, and beneath the shifting desert, there may lie records waiting to be uncovered. Some explorers and mystics have long claimed that a hidden hall of records exists, an archive of ancient knowledge reserved from Atlantis and hidden for a future age. Whether literal or metaphorical, the idea persists that Egypt's role in human history is not merely as an origin, but as a bridge, a link between the remembered and the forgotten, the living and the drowned. In the end, Egypt remains both a monument to human ingenuity and a riddle of origins. Its temples whisper of gods, floods, and beginnings that may not have begun on the Nile at all. And as we study its mysteries, we are left to wonder, were the Egyptians the first great architect of civilization, or simply the last great inheritors of a world already lost beneath the sea? There are few symbols of lost wisdom more powerful than the Library of Alexandria. Imagine it, a colossal repository of scrolls, maps, and manuscripts gathered from every corner of the known world, standing at the crossroads of civilization. Founded in the 3rd century BC under the Ptolemies, it was said to house hundreds of thousands of works, texts from Greece, Egypt, Babylon, India, and beyond. But within those countless scrolls may also have lain something far older, records that carried whispers of Atlantis, fragments of knowledge reserved by those who remembered the drowned world. The library's mission was nothing short of total. Ships arriving in Alexandria were compelled to surrender any texts they carried, which were then copied by scribes. The originals often remained in the library while copies were returned to their owners. In this way, the library became not just a collection but a hunger, a vast, insatiable archive devouring the wisdom of all nations. If fragments of ancient maps survived anywhere, if echoes of prehistory were preserved in writing, the Library of Alexandria would have been their sanctuary. Yet the tragedy of the library lies in its destruction. Historians still debate when and how it fell. Some blame Julius Caesar's siege in 48 BCE, others a later decree of Emperor Theodosius in 391 CE, or even a Muslim conquest centuries later. Perhaps the truth is that it suffered not one catastrophe but many, each fire and neglect stripping away layer after layer of memory. What is certain is this: whatever knowledge it held, it is gone, and with it, perhaps, the greatest secrets of humanity's forgotten past. Consider what might have been inside. The Egyptians themselves hinted at records of earlier ages, long cycles of civilization stretching back thousands of years before the pharaohs. Babylonian star charts, Indian cosmologies, Greek philosophical works, all could have been stored there, cross-pollinating, revealing patterns across cultures that pointed to a shared origin. Within this chorus of voices, perhaps, were accounts of a great cataclysm, maps of lost continents, and scientific knowledge too advanced for its time. The Library of Alexandria could have been the very bridge linking Atlantis to recorded history. The emotional weight of its loss is difficult to overstate. Ancient writers who glimpsed its collection spoke of marvels now vanished, treatises on medicine, engineering, astronomy, and geography that might have accelerated human progress by centuries. Imagine if the world had never entered a dark age. Imagine if we had inherited not just the wisdom of Greece and Rome, but also the hidden legacies of civilizations long erased. The human story might look entirely different. And yet, even in its destruction, the library has left behind a strange kind of ghost. Many believe that fragments of its collection survive, carried off before the flames, hidden in private archives or secreted into temples. Some point to the Hermetic texts, preserved in fragments through the Middle Ages, as survivors of the library's wisdom. Others suggest that the Vatican's vast and tightly controlled archives contain remnants, scrolls too dangerous or too revelatory to release. If this is true, then the Library of Alexandria did not vanish completely. It simply went underground, its secrets guarded by the few. The link to Atlantis emerges when we consider the origins of Plato's account. He claimed the story of Atlantis was preserved in Egypt, told to Solon by priests who kept records older than Greece itself. If those records were still held in Alexandria, they might have formed part of the collection. It is not impossible to imagine a scroll resting on its shelves, describing in detail the geography of the lost island, its rulers, and its downfall. Alongside it, Perhaps were maps like those later echoed by Piri Reis and Phineus, maps that should not have existed, yet somehow did. The thought that such scrolls were once within human grasp, only to be consigned to ash, is almost unbearable. But there's another, darker possibility. Some suggest that the library was not merely destroyed by accident or neglect, but deliberately targeted. Knowledge is power, and too much knowledge can be dangerous. If the scrolls of Alexandria contained truths that challenge the accepted order of history, religion, or empire, there would have been strong motives to silence them. The fires, in this reading, were not only acts of war but acts of erasure. If so, then the destruction of the Library of Alexandria was not just a tragedy but a crime, a deliberate severing of humanity from its own forgotten past. Even today, the library's memory provokes fascination and longing. Modern attempts to recreate it, such as the Bibliotheca Alexandrina built near the ancient site, are noble but symbolic. They cannot resurrect what was lost. For the scrolls themselves are gone, and with them perhaps the clearest evidence we might ever have had of Atlantis' survival into historical memory. Yet the story of the library serves another purpose. It reminds us of the fragility of knowledge. Civilizations rise and fall, archives burn, and what remains is only what we fight to preserve. The tale of Atlantis, the maps of impossible coastlines, the myths of floods and golden ages, they may all be the faint echoes of scrolls that once lay in Alexandria's halls. And in this sense, the library is not merely a symbol of loss, but a challenge. It dares us to imagine how much we do not know, how much lies buried not only in the sands of Egypt but in the ashes of forgotten shelves. In the end, the Library of Alexandria is both a dream and a warning. It tells us that knowledge is fleeting, that history is fragile, and that entire worlds of memory can vanish in a single blaze. But it also tells us that the search must go on, that somewhere, perhaps hidden in dusty monasteries or locked vaults, fragments of that ancient archive survive, waiting to be rediscovered. And if they do, they may yet confirm what so many have long suspected, that behind the myth of Atlantis lies a reality too vast, too dangerous, and too extraordinary to be forgotten. Across the vast landscapes of the ancient world, stories often travel further than the people who told them. Myths, legends, and whispered tales found their way into distant cultures, leaving behind echoes that seem too similar to be coincidence. When we listen closely, we begin to notice a pattern. Civilizations that never touched one another, separated by oceans and millennia, all spoke of lost lands, sunken kingdoms, and great floods that erased whole nations from history. Could these echoes be fragments of one shared story, a memory so powerful it refused to die? In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians told of a great deluge, one so catastrophic it forced the gods themselves to reconsider the fate of humankind. Thousands of miles away, in Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztec people spoke of suns and worlds destroyed in cycles of chaos and renewal, each world wiped clean by fire or flood before another rose. The Greeks had Atlantis, swallowed by the sea. The Hindus had tales of Dwarka, the golden city of Krishna, drowned beneath the waves. And among the indigenous peoples of North America, stories of vanished islands and great waters reshaping the earth echoed once more. How could so many separate voices sing the same refrain? Scholars often point to the universality of human imagination. Floods, after all, were real and recurring natural disasters. They scarred landscapes and civilizations alike. But even this explanation does not silence the unease, for the parallels stretch beyond mere survival stories. These myths often describe not only destruction, but advanced societies lost in the disaster. They speak of wisdom, maps, and knowledge of the stars vanishing beneath the sea, as though history itself was swallowed whole. Take the Popol Vuh, the sacred text of the Keish Maya. Within its verses, there are hints of former worlds erased, leaving only fragments of humanity to rebuild upon. Or the Ramayana of India, which describes vast cities of shining architecture, flying machines, and cosmic wars. Legends some claim are the memories of once great civilizations that perished. Even in Polynesian myths, the sea is not only a barrier but a devourer, swallowing islands whole while leaving behind warnings carved into chants and stone. If Atlantis was merely Plato's philosophical allegory, why then do so many other cultures speak of similar lost realms? Could these tales be distorted memories of a single cataclysmic event? Was there a primal trauma shared by humanity, preserved through myth because it was too important to forget? The possibility is haunting. And here lies the deeper mystery. Some of these myths contain geographical knowledge that should not exist. Maps embedded in stories, descriptions of lands and waters uncannily accurate for their supposed age, directions to places thought impossible for those cultures to have known. Did ancient storytellers unwittingly preserve the fragments of a global map, a hidden inheritance from a time before recorded history? It is tempting to dismiss these echoes as simple coincidences. Yet, when viewed together, they form a chorus that refuses silence. They beg us to question whether our ancestors were passing along more than just cautionary tales. Perhaps they were carrying fragments of a truth too immense to grasp in full, fragments that may point toward a real civilization wiped from history. The myths whisper of destruction, but they also hint at survival. Survivors who carried knowledge into new lands. Survivors who may have drawn maps, charted stars, or seeded the myths that still haunt us today. Were they the hidden cartographers of humanity's forgotten past? If so, the question grows even sharper. Did the maps of Atlantis survive, not as parchment or stone, but as stories etched into the memory of every civilization that followed? And if these stories are indeed maps, what were they guiding us toward? Would you like me to now expand Section 10 in the same cinematic and mysterious style? Hidden within the chronicles of history are figures who seem strangely ahead of their time, navigators, priests, and sages who possess knowledge of lands they should never have known, coastlines they should never have seen, and stars mapped with precision that baffles even modern scholars. These forgotten cartographers left behind fragments of their genius, etched in stone, encoded in myth, or whispered through the fragile medium of parchment. They stand as shadows between worlds, neither fully myth nor fully historical, yet carrying the aura of something greater. Consider the mysterious Piri Reis Map of 1513, a parchment fragment drawn by an Ottoman admiral but compiled from far older sources. It depicts the coastlines of South America and Antarctica with shocking accuracy, centuries before explorers reached such places. How could this be? Piri Reis himself claimed he copied from ancient maps, maps that may have survived from civilizations long vanished. He was not their creator, but their inheritor, a custodian of cartographic memory stretching back into unrecorded time. But the mystery does not begin in the Renaissance. Across the ruins of Egypt, the temples of India, and the cities of Mesoamerica, one finds clues to a startling truth, that ancient priests were not merely religious figures but keepers of astronomical and geographical knowledge. The priests of Heliopolis charted the heavens with obsessive detail, aligning temples with solstices and star risings. The Mayan astronomers recorded Venus with such accuracy that their calculations rival our own. In India, the sages of Vedic tradition mapped the movement of celestial bodies across immense spans of time, cycles measured not in years but in ages. Were these star maps only spiritual tools, or did they double as guides, encoding navigation across the earth itself? The idea is not as far-fetched as it may sound. To navigate oceans, one must first navigate the sky. Early sailors learned that the stars were the truest compass, their unchanging power providing direction long before compasses or sextants existed. If the guardians of ancient knowledge charted the heavens so meticulously, it stands to reason that their skill could be translated into terrestrial mapping. The stars above could become coordinates for the lands below. What if some of these maps, these celestial-terrestrial hybrids, originated not from the cultures who preserved them, but from an even older source? Could there have been a civilization, perhaps Atlantis itself, that charted both stars and seas with a sophistication we have forgotten? When that civilization perished, its knowledge might not have vanished entirely. Instead, fragments of its cartography could have survived in the hands of scattered survivors, priests, navigators, or refugees who carried their charts into new lands, where they became the seeds of myth and mystery. This idea gains strength when we look at the remarkable similarities in ancient world maps. The Babylonian map of the world, etched on clay, places a circular landmass surrounded by waters and mysterious regions beyond. The Greeks later spoke of okeanos encircling the earth. The Polynesians, master navigators of the Pacific, carried oral maps of the ocean, star charts, wave patterns, bird migrations, passed down through chants. Though scattered across continents and centuries, each tradition suggests that map-making was not a modern invention but a forgotten art, one that once connected distant lands long before official history admits. These forgotten cartographers were not merely technicians, they were visionaries. They understood the world as a whole, a sphere to be traversed, not a flat plane with abrupt edges. Their maps whispered of unity, of a globe interconnected by seas and skies. And yet, curiously, mainstream history insists that such knowledge was beyond the reach of early cultures. We are told that true global mapping did not emerge until the Age of Discovery. But then, how do we explain the Piri Reis Map, or the Oronteus Finaeus projection, or the uncanny accuracy of some medieval Portolan charts that appear rooted in knowledge predating the very civilizations that drew them? Perhaps the answer lies in transmission. Knowledge, like fire, does not always ignite in you. It is passed hand to hand, keeper to keeper, across generations. The forgotten cartographers may not always have understood the origins of the maps they guarded. They may have worshipped them as relics, embedded them in myths, or interpreted them through the lens of their own worldviews. Yet still, the maps endured, surviving calamities, wars, and floods, always reappearing in the least likely of places. This persistence hints at deliberate preservation. Imagine, for a moment, a group of survivors from a sunken land, a handful of priests, scholars, or navigators who carried with them fragments of their charts. Knowing their world was ending, they may have seen their maps not simply as tools of travel, but as vessels of hope, guiding future generations toward rebuilding. To lose the maps would be to lose the memory of their world. To preserve them was to preserve a piece of eternity. It is this haunting possibility that the maps were more than geography, that they were memory itself, that lingers as we look at the evidence. Each chart, each scrap of ancient cartographic mystery, is like a ghostly voice calling out from the depths of history. These were the forgotten cartographers, guardians of knowledge from a time we barely comprehend. And if their maps truly did originate in a vanished age, then their legacy remains hidden all around us, waiting to be deciphered. But there is a darker question that follows. If such maps once existed, and fragments still survive, who controls them now? Were they quietly erased from mainstream history to protect a secret too dangerous to acknowledge? Or do they still wait in archives, misfiled and ignored, their true significance unseen? If the maps of the forgotten cartographers are real, they may not simply point to lost lands of the past. They may also reveal secrets about our present world, secrets hidden in plain sight. The deeper we go into this mystery, the more it begins to feel less like ancient history and more like a puzzle that was meant for us to solve. Would you like me to now expand Section 11 with the same cinematic, emotional, and mysterious depth? If civilizations once rose and fell before our recorded history, then their knowledge too must have been lost, washed away like sand beneath the tide. Yet whispers persist of something extraordinary, libraries that did not vanish entirely, but instead lie buried beneath the oceans, hidden under the ruins of drowned cities or encased in the seabed. These stories are not just the stuff of fantasy. In scattered places across the world, divers, archaeologists, and even fishermen have stumbled upon submerged ruins that hint at forgotten archives, repositories of wisdom preserved beneath the waves. One of the most haunting examples lies off the coast of Japan, near Yonaguni. Here, massive stone formations rise from the seafloor, steps and terraces that look uncannily like a sunken city. Some argue it is a natural formation, but others see the hand of human design, sharp angles, flat platforms, even what appears to be a carved face staring into the abyss. If Yonaguni was once above water, then it may have been a city swallowed by the rising seas at the end of the last ice age. And if it was a city, then surely it would have housed knowledge, perhaps even a library of its own. But Japan is only one piece of this watery puzzle. Off the coast of India, near Dwarka, divers discovered submerged ruins that some believe to be linked to the legendary city of Krishna. Ancient texts describe Dwarka as a place of golden towers and radiant palaces, a city that glittered until it was swallowed by the sea. The ruins beneath the waves echo these tales, with stone walls, streets, and possible temple structures eerily preserved. What wisdom did Dwarka carry into the depths? Were its texts, scrolls, or carved inscriptions lost forever, or do fragments still rest upon the seabed, locked away from human hands? In the Mediterranean, too, the waters conceal secrets. Near Alexandria, where the great library once stood, archaeologists have found traces of sunken palaces, statues, and causeways beneath the harbor. While no scrolls have survived, one cannot help but wonder if manuscripts were stored in waterproof containers, clay jars, or stone chambers, could fragments of ancient knowledge still lie hidden under the silt? The idea is tantalizing, especially since the great library itself is a symbol of knowledge lost aflame. Might the ocean have preserved what fire consumed? Legends add more fuel to the mystery. The Maya spoke of libraries hidden within sacred caves, some of which were flooded when the rains and waters rose. The Hopi and Zuni tribes tell of records stored underground by their ancestors, shielded from the purification of water. In Greece, stories of Atlantis itself describe halls of learning, vast repositories where priests guarded records of their civilization's greatness. If Atlantis sank, then so too did its archives, scrolls, maps, and star charts perhaps encased in stone, sealed away beneath the very waters that claimed them. Science offers both hope and caution here. Papyrus and parchment would indeed dissolve in water, but stone carvings, metal inscriptions, or tablets of fired clay could survive for millennia. And more intriguingly, some legends describe records not as fragile scrolls but as objects of crystal, metal, or unknown materials, technologies of preservation lost to us now. Could the so-called crystal libraries of Atlantis, described in esoteric traditions, hold a grain of truth? Perhaps what sank beneath the waves was not just myth, but a medium of knowledge far beyond the fragile ink of latest civilizations. Even in the modern era, the oceans have yielded uncanny discoveries. Off the coast of Cuba, sonar scans have revealed geometric shapes 2,000 feet beneath the sea, massive blocks, walls, and pyramidal structures. The site is so deep it would have required submersion long before recorded history. If this is truly a sunken city, it suggests that entire civilizations, and possibly their archives, lie beyond the reach of our current exploration. The very idea of a library beneath the waves stirs a strange emotion, or mixed with melancholy. For if such archives exist, they hold keys to questions we can barely frame. They could reveal the origins of navigation, astronomy, or even forgotten sciences. They might contain the original maps of Atlantis, charts etched with coastlines now erased by time. But even more haunting is the thought that they may already have been found. Ancient records speak of treasure hunters, conquerors, and secret societies who scour the seas for lost wisdom. If fragments of these underwater libraries were recovered, they may not have been shared with the world. They may instead have been hoarded, hidden once more, not by nature this time, but by human hands. The ocean, then, becomes both a grave and a vault. It swallows, but it also preserves. Beneath its endless tides, knowledge may be waiting, unread, unclaimed, and unimaginable in its scope. Every ripple across the water could conceal the shadow of a library that might change everything we know of human history. And so the question lingers, were the greatest archives of Atlantis not lost, but simply drowned, their silence broken only by the patience of the sea? Across the ancient world, there runs a thread of myth that suggests humanity did not invent its maps alone. Instead, the knowledge of measuring the earth, charting the heavens, and navigating seas may have come from beings the ancients called gods. These map-makers of the gods appear in stories across every continent, and though their names differ, their role is eerily consistent. They descend from the sky or rise from the sea, bearing knowledge of agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and maps of a world humanity had not yet explored. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki, celestial beings who measured the heavens and laid out the earth. Their records describe star charts and mathematical systems that appear astonishingly advanced for the world's first recorded civilization. Some tablets depict the cosmos not as a flat dome, but as a layered universe with planets arranged in orbits, knowledge our science only rediscovered thousands of years later. Were these gods astronomers? Or were they survivors of an earlier civilization, mistaken for divine messengers because their knowledge seemed supernatural? Travel west to Egypt, and the same motif appears. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, was said to have invented writing, mathematics, and the art of measurement. He was a scribe of the gods, keeper of sacred books that contained maps of the heavens and the earth. Egyptian legends speak of hidden chambers, sometimes called a Hall of Records, where Thoth stored scrolls that charted not only Egypt's history but also the geography of lost lands. Could these stories point to Atlantean survivors embedding their cartographic knowledge within the temples of Egypt, cloaked in myth to protect it from destruction? The pattern repeats in Mesoamerica. The Maya and Aztec revered Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who emerged after a great flood to teach humanity how to count, build, and track the cycles of stars. In Andean myth, Viracocha, a bearded god of light, walked among the ruins after a cataclysm, teaching navigation and ordering the tribes to spread across the world. Both figures are credited with ordering the land, as though they were mapping anew a world reshaped by disaster. And in Polyneia, the very art of navigation is attributed to divine origins. The god Tangaroa, ruler of the seas, was believed to have gifted humanity the knowledge of the stars, winds, and currents. Polynesian wayfinders carried this legacy for thousands of years, traversing the Pacific with uncanny accuracy, guided by oral star maps passed down as sacred chants. To them, navigation was not just science but a spiritual inheritance, a gift from God who once crossed the oceans themselves. What is striking is not just the similarity of these myths, but the way they describe their knowledge, precise, ordered, mathematical. These were not vague religious parables, but detailed instructions for measuring and mapping. The gods, it seems, were cartographers. Skeptics, of course, argue that these myths simply reflect humanity's ingenuity wrapped in divine metaphor. But there's a deeper question here. Why does nearly every culture trace its mapping knowledge back to otherworldly beings? Why do they so often describe these figures as carrying records, tablets, scrolls, crystals, or celestial charts that resemble maps? Could this be the echo of a real encounter, not with supernatural gods, but with human survivors of an advanced, lost civilization who appeared divine to scattered tribes rebuilding after catastrophe? Some esoteric traditions take the idea further, claiming that these map makers were not human at all. Instead, they suggest extraterrestrial origins, beings who descended from the stars and mapped the earth as part of a grand design. While such theories remain controversial, they resonate powerfully with the myths themselves, which frequently describe the gods as descending in fiery chariots or luminous crafts, bearing tools unknown to mortals. Were these the true map-makers, shaping humanity's understanding of geography from the skies above? But perhaps the most haunting possibility is that the gods were both real and symbolic, survivors of Atlantis or another lost civilization whose mastery of navigation, astronomy, and measurement was so far beyond the shattered tribes of the post-cataclysmic world that it appeared divine. Their maps, geographical and celestial, became the foundation upon which new cultures built their calendars, temples, and voyages. Over time, memory blurred into myth, and the map-makers became gods. If so, then the maps of the gods may still exist, not in scrolls or stone tablets alone, but encoded in the architecture and rituals they inspired. The alignments of temples, the solstices, the geometric precision of pyramids, the sacred geometry of mandalas and labyrinths, all may be echoes of a greater cartographic system, a hidden grid stretching across the earth and stars. A system that was once whole, but now survives only in fragments. And yet, the question remains, did these divine cartographers leave us a final map, one pointing back to the source of their knowledge? Were the gods not just teachers, but guides, nudging humanity toward rediscovering the homeland they themselves had lost? Atlantis may not only have been remembered through Plato's words, but preserved in the myths of the gods themselves, Atlantean survivors deified by those who received their maps. The more we trace these myths, the more we see a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Humanity did not stumble blindly into the art of mapping. We were shown, guided, perhaps even chosen. The gods, or those mistaken for gods, were cartographers first, myth-makers second. And their maps, whether celestial, terrestrial, or both, may still be whispering to us through the stories we tell, urging us to look deeper. Before the age of compasses and satellites, before sextants and steel ships, ancient navigators crossed oceans with a confidence that seems, even now, almost impossible. They sailed vast distances guided only by the stars, the sun, the shape of waves, and the behavior of birds. Their journeys, preserved in fragments of oral tradition and archaeological evidence, form one of the greatest puzzles of human history. For how could such early mariners, without our modern instruments, have mapped the sea so accurately, and in some cases reached lands that history insists they should never have known? The Phoenicians, master sailors of the Mediterranean, are said to have ventured beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the vast Atlantic. Some accounts suggest they may have circumnavigated Africa as early as 600 BCE, an achievement officially credited to Europeans 2,000 years later. Their skills in navigation were legendary, and yet they left behind few records, only whispers of knowledge passed from guild to guild, generation to generation. Could fragments of their charts have been derived from sources even older, maps passed down from civilizations erased by time? across the Pacific. The Polynesians practiced a form of navigation so advanced that modern seafarers still marvel at its precision. Without metal tools or written maps, they charted a network of islands spanning thousands of miles, from Hawaii to Easter Island to New Zealand. They used the stars as guides, but also read the ocean itself. The subtle bending of swells around unseen islands, the flight paths of birds, the color of clouds reflecting hidden lagoons. Their star compasses were not etched in parchment but memoized in chants and rituals, a living map stored in the mind. Such knowledge suggests a tradition of navigation stretching back millennia, perhaps rooted in an inheritance from cultures now lost beneath the waves. The Norse Vikings, too, crossed the North Atlantic long before Columbus, reaching Greenland and even the shores of North America. Their sagas speak of mysterious lands westward, rich with timber and wild grapes. Some researchers believe they used sunstones, crystals that could polarize light and reveal the sun's position even on cloudy days. If true, this was an ingenious method, one that implies a scientific sophistication rarely attributed to so-called barbarian cultures. But where did they learn it? Was it an independent discovery, or another echo of older knowledge passed quietly across generations? And then there are the tantalizing anomalies. The Olmecs of ancient Mexico carved colossal heads with distinctly African features, sparking debates about whether transatlantic contact occurred long before Columbus. In South America, sweet potatoes, native to the Andes, were found growing in Polynesia centuries before European exploration, evidence of contact between the two regions. How could such exchanges have happened without maps? Were ancient navigators carrying routes inherited from forgotten cartographers, following coastlines and currents laid down long before? One cannot ignore the possibility that some ancient navigation was guided not only by observation, but by records, maps now lost to us. The Piri Reis Map is one example, but it may not have been unique. Fragments of even older maps, encoded in oral tradition or stored in temples, could have guided sailors across oceans with uncanny accuracy. Myths of sea roads and pathways of the gods may not be poetic imagery, but literal references to map routes across the waters, passed from Atlantis or another vanished culture into the hands of later civilizations. Yet the deeper mystery is not just that they navigated, but that they remembered. Navigation requires continuity, a tradition passed intact across centuries. But if a global catastrophe struck at the end of the last ice age, wiping out coastal civilizations, how did the survivors preserve their charts? Perhaps they did so in the only way they could, embedding them in myths, rituals, and sacred practices. The Polynesian chants, the Egyptian alignments, the Mayan codices, all may be remnants of a single ancient tradition of navigation, recast into cultural form so they would not be forgotten. The emotional power of this puzzle is undeniable. Imagine a Polynesian canoe setting out into the endless Pacific night, guided only by starlight and memory, yet carrying with it the weight of an unbroken tradition. Imagine a Phoenician ship sailing beyond the horizon, trusting maps copied from sources so old their origins were already forgotten. Imagine Norse explorers braving the icy seas, their eyes fixed on the hidden sun revealed through a shard of crystal. Each of these navigators carried within them more than courage. They carried a thread of something ancient, a secret inheritance whispering of lands beyond sight. And so we are left with a haunting possibility. Ancient navigation was not an isolated achievement, but the faint glow of a torch lit long before. A torch passed from a forgotten civilization to its scattered heirs, guiding them across oceans they should not have been able to cross. If that is true, then every ancient voyage is more than history. It is a message, a reminder that humanity once knew the world in ways we are only beginning to rediscover. But what were these navigators truly seeking? Were they explorers, traders, survivors, or were they following maps that pointed back to something greater, a homeland lost beneath the waves? The puzzle of ancient navigation remains unsolved, but the clues point again and again to the same haunting question. Who drew the first map of the seas, and what became of them? If the oceans were the highways of ancient explorers, then the stars were their signposts. Yet, when we look deeper, it becomes clear that astronomy in the ancient world was not just about navigation. It was a code, a language written across the heavens that concealed maps of the earth itself. From the pyramids of Egypt to the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, from Stonehenge in Britain to the observatories of the Maya, cultures across the globe aligned their greatest monuments not randomly, but with exact precision to celestial events. What message were they encoding in stone? And why did so many separate civilizations feel compelled to build their lives around the same cosmic patterns? In Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Giza is not only aligned perfectly to the cardinal points of the compass, but its shafts point to specific stars, Orion's belt and Sirius, celestial markers tied to myths of death, rebirth, and the afterlife. Yet some researchers argue these alignments go further. They suggest the pyramid complex as a whole mirrors the stars of Orion's belt in their precise arrangement, as though the Earth itself were being used as a canvas to map the sky. If true, this is more than symbolic architecture. It is a merging of heaven and earth, a code in stone. But what was its purpose? Was it simply religious devotion, or a message, a star map meant to preserve knowledge of a lost homeland? The Sumerians and Babylonians, too, charted the heavens with astonishing accuracy. They divided the sky into constellations, calculated planetary motions, and created one of the earliest known star catalogues. What makes this remarkable is not just their precision, but their insistence that this knowledge was inherited, not invented. According to their own accounts, the measuring of the heavens was a gift from the gods, a wisdom passed down rather than discovered. If this is true, who or what were these teachers? Survivors of an older culture who encoded navigation routes into the constellations themselves? Travel across the Atlantic to the Maya, and we find yet another culture obsessed with the stars. Their entire calendar system was rooted in astronomical cycles. The movements of the sun, the phases of Venus, the eclipses of the moon. Their cities were aligned to solstices and equinoxes, and their observatories rival those of much later civilizations. But here again, we find something stranger. Myths that describe the sky as a great book, a cosmic record that reflects not only the heavens but the world below. To the Maya, the sky was not just a map of stars. It was a mirror of the earth, encoded with meaning. Even in Europe, megalithic structures like Stonehenge reveal a similar obsession. The great circle of stones is aligned to the midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset, forming a cosmic calendar. Other stone circles across Britain, Ireland, and Brittany align with lunar standstills and star risings, suggesting that even prehistoric cultures had developed complex astronomical systems. But why? Why did so many people across time and geography feel compelled to build immense monuments that functioned as sky maps? Could it be that these alignments preserved more than ritual knowledge, that they encoded geographical information as well? Some researchers suggest that ancient star maps may have doubled as navigation guides, teaching sailors to link the stars above with the lands below, turning the cosmos into a global chart. This idea becomes more compelling when we consider the recurring motifs in mythology. Time and again, gods are said to have come from the stars or returned to the heavens. Heroes navigate by following constellations. Civilizations rise and fall in cycles tied to celestial movements. What if these stories were more than myth? What if they were instructions, encrypted knowledge meant to ensure that even if written maps were destroyed, humanity would always have a guide in the night sky? The emotional power of this possibility is striking. Imagine survivors of a great cataclysm, their libraries burned, their maps drowned beneath the sea. How could they ensure their descendants would remember? By turning to the one canvas no flood or fire could erase, the sky itself. By encoding their knowledge into alignments, myths, and rituals, they transformed astronomy into a living code, one that could survive for millennia. And so we are left with a haunting question. Were the pyramids, ziggurats, stone circles, and temples of the ancient world not merely religious monuments, but keys to an astronomical cipher? Were they pieces of a map that stretched across earth and sky, guiding future generations toward the memory of a lost civilization? If so, then we are only beginning to crack the code. Modern science can measure alignments, calculate star risings, and simulate ancient skies, but we may still lack the key to understand what these monuments were truly pointing toward. Were they marking the heavens, or were they marking a place on earth, a location we have yet to rediscover? Perhaps the astronomical code is not just about where humanity has been, but where we must look. If the stars were the memory of Atlantis, then decoding them might reveal more than myth. It might reveal the very map of a civilization erased from history, waiting for us to follow the trail they left across the heavens. When we think of maps, we imagine parchment, ink, and careful measurements. But long before the world was charted by compasses and globes, there were maps that seemed to defy the capabilities of their time. Maps so advanced that they suggest access to knowledge far older than the civilizations credited with them. These are not ordinary documents. They are puzzles, whispers from the past, and perhaps the fingerprints of forgotten cartographers who carried forward the memory of lands now lost. One of the most enigmatic examples is the Piri Reis Map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral. At first glance, it seems like a marvel of Renaissance cartography, but upon closer inspection, it holds an impossible truth. The map appears to depict the coastline of South America in precise detail, long before Europeans were supposed to have explored it so thoroughly. Even stranger, it includes a representation of Antarctica, not as it is today under miles of ice, but as it might have appeared ice-free thousands of years ago. How could a 16th century admiral possess such knowledge? Piri Reis himself claimed he based his work on ancient charts, fragments passed down through centuries, whose origins were shrouded in mystery. If the Piri Reis Map were an isolated anomaly, it might be dismissed. But it is not alone. The Oronteus Finaeus map of 1531 also shows Antarctica with rivers, valleys, and mountain ranges, as though the cartographer had access to surveys taken when the continent was not buried under ice. The Bois map of 1737, too, depicts the Antarctic coastline beneath its frozen shell. Modern satellite imaging has confirmed that these hidden landforms are accurate, suggesting that whoever first charted them had an astonishing vantage point, knowledge we associate only with aerial or satellite mapping today. This raises profound questions. Did ancient seafarers possess a level of navigational skill far beyond what we acknowledge? Or did these maps descend from a culture that had charted the world long before recorded history, perhaps before the last ice age buried parts of the earth in ice? To some researchers, these cartographic relics are not accidents, but evidence of a global surveying project carried out by a forgotten civilization, one whose memory lingers only in maps copied and recopied across generations. The implications are staggering. Imagine an advanced maritime culture, sailing across oceans tens of thousands of years ago, mapping coastlines with precision instruments now lost to time. As their world collapsed, perhaps swallowed by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age, their knowledge survived, preserved in fragments of charts that later navigators stumbled upon and incorporated into their own maps. Over centuries, these fragments became whispers of a lost archive, a library of geography erased from human memory but too accurate to be ignored. Even mainstream historians have struggled to explain these anomalies. While some argue that the coastline shown could have been imagined or distorted interpretations, others admit the accuracy of certain details defies coincidence. For example, the longitudinal accuracy of some sections suggests calculations that would have required knowledge of spherical trigonometry and highly precise instruments, tools supposedly unavailable until many centuries later. How could cartographers working in the 1500s, with no satellites, no aerial surveys, and limited exploration, chart land as though they had access to a god's-eye view of the earth? But perhaps the more haunting question is, who were the original cartographers? Were they remnants of seafaring peoples like the Phoenicians or Minoans, whose influence spread further than history remembers? Or were they survivors of a cataclysmic event, carrying fragments of maps from a homeland that no longer exists, an Atlantis, swallowed by water but remembered through geography? To them, maps may have been not just tools of navigation, but sacred relics, records of a lost world they longed to preserve. And this is where the emotional weight strikes deepest. If these maps truly echo the knowledge of an erased civilization, then they are not just curiosities. They are the desperate attempt of ancestors to be remembered. Each coastline, each mountain range, is a voice from the past saying, "We were here. We knew the world. Do not forget us." The presence of these maps also forces us to reconsider our own history. If fragments of a global cartographic system survived into the hands of Renaissance navigators, how much else has been lost? What libraries sank beneath the waves? What scrolls turned to ashen fires? What knowledge slipped away in the collapse of empires? If maps could survive in fragments for thousands of years, could there be more, still hidden, waiting to surface? Modern scholars have begun to re-examine these anomalies with new tools. Digital scans, geological surveys, and satellite imaging have only deepened the mystery, confirming that features once dismissed as coincidence are in fact accurate representations. The possibility grows harder to ignore. That humanity's understanding of geography is not a story of linear progress, but a cycle of remembering and forgetting, of rediscovery after catastrophic loss. And so, the mystery of the secret cartographers lingers like an unfinished sentence. Were they simply talented navigators who pushed the boundaries of exploration? Or were they guardians of a memory stretching back to an age when continents looked different, seas were lower, and civilizations were no longer acknowledged walked the earth? If the stars were the code of the ancients, then maps were their testimony, drawn not only to guide ships, but to remind us of what once was. Perhaps these maps are fragments of a greater truth, a record of a world erased, waiting for us to piece together the puzzle. Each line of coastline, each strange accuracy, is like a fingerprint pressed into the parchment of history, urging us to follow it back to a civilization that refused to vanish completely. Beneath the frozen silence of Antarctica lies one of the most haunting mysteries of all. Today, the continent is a realm of endless white, a desert of ice stretching beyond the horizon, seemingly devoid of life and history. Yet deep within its frozen layers, there are whispers, geological hints, satellite anomalies, and ancient legends that suggest Antarctica has not always been so lifeless. Once, long before humanity's memory begins, it may have been a land of rivers, forests, and even civilizations. Modern science has confirmed that Antarctica was not always frozen. Millions of years ago, it was covered in lush greenery, teeming with life. Fossils of ancient forests and marine creatures buried beneath the ice confirm that this now desolate place once supported ecosystems unimaginable in its current state. But while science explains a distant past, it cannot account for the strange anomalies that appear in human history. For instance, why do maps like those of Piri Reis and Oronteus Finaeus depict Antarctica's coastline as though the ice were not there? How could early cartographers have drawn what modern satellites only confirmed in the 20th century? The possibility that Antarctica was once known to ancient seafarers is a chilling thought. It suggests that explorers reached the southernmost reaches of the planet in an age when humanity supposedly lacked the means to cross such distances. Some researchers even suggest that if the coastline was mapped ice-free, it must have been surveyed at least 6,000 years ago, when Antarctica was still partially unfrozen. That date pushes us far beyond a timeline of known civilizations, into a shadowy prehistory where little is certain. Yet, the intrigue does not stop with ancient maps. In recent decades, satellite imaging has revealed massive geometric anomalies beneath the ice, patterns that some claim resemble structures too symmetrical to be natural. Vast rectangles buried deep below the surface. Dome-like formations emerging through the ice. Even the outlines of what looks like ancient roadways. Mainstream scientists caution restraint, reminding us that glacier can carve unexpected shapes, and the mind is quick to see patterns where none exist. But the sense of unease lingers, as though Antarctica itself is hiding something it does not want us to find. Legends, too, add fuel to the mystery. Indigenous myths from South America sometimes speak of lands far to the south, cold and dangerous, from which strange visitors came. Some theorists believe that echoes of Atlantis may point southward, that Plato's lost island was not in the Atlantic Ocean, but buried beneath the frozen waste of Antarctica. If true, then Atlantis would not have sunk, but frozen, entombed beneath miles of ice after the catastrophic shifts of the end of the last ice age. What makes this speculation more compelling are the shifting records of Earth's poles. Evidence suggests that the planet's crust has not always been stable, that pole shifts and massive crustal movements may have altered the positions of continents within human memory. If Antarctica was once closer to the equator, it would have been temperate, habitable, and ideal for an advanced culture. A sudden shift, combined with glaciation, could have buried that world almost overnight, erasing its existence while preserving its ruins beneath the ice. For those who believe Antarctica holds secrets, it is not only history but destiny at stake. Imagine what might lie waiting under those miles of ice, libraries of knowledge, temples of stone, or technologies beyond our comprehension, perfectly preserved in the cold. Some even whisper of suppressed discoveries, expeditions that uncovered more than they revealed, scientists who returned with stories they dared not publish. The frozen continent has been the stage of countless rumors, hidden bases, secret excavations, even sightings of colossal structures. Though most belong to the realm of speculation, they add to Antarctica's aura of untouchable secrecy. At the heart of this enigma lies the emotional tension between silence and revelation. Antarctica is a land we are told is empty, barren, and without history, yet it may hold the deepest memory of all. A silent witness to cataclysm, a graveyard of civilizations erased not by war or conquest, but by the unrelenting power of ice. The thought alone is staggering. Beneath our feet may lie the answers to humanity's oldest riddle, locked away in a frozen tomb. And this brings us to the haunting question. If Antarctica does indeed guard the remains of a lost world, is it waiting to be discovered, or waiting to be left alone? For sometimes, what is buried for a reason. Sometimes, the silence of the ice is a warning, not an invitation. If Atlantis truly perished in a single night of fire and flood, as Plato described, then logic suggests its people could not have all vanished. Catastrophes, however sudden, rarely erase entire populations. Some must have survived, refugees cast adrift, clutching fragments of their culture, carrying memories of a homeland swallowed by the sea. And it is within these survivors that the legend may have taken on a second life, scattered across the world like seeds on the wind. The idea of Atlantean survivors is not only poetic, it resonates with patterns in ancient myth and archaeology. Across Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Mesoamerica, stories speak of mysterious visitors who appeared suddenly, bringing with them knowledge that seemed beyond the reach of early societies. They are remembered as teachers, architects, and bringers of law, agriculture, astronomy, and sacred geometry. In some tales, they were gods. In others, they were sages. But their role was always the same, to ignite the spark of civilization. In Egypt, the law of Thoth, later known to the Greeks as Hermes Trismegistus, paints him as a bringer of wisdom, a scribe who taught humanity the arts of writing, astronomy, and measurement. Could Thoth have been a memory of one such survivor, a man whose origins were wrapped in divine mystery because they came from a world that no longer existed? In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, is said to have arrived from across the sea. He was described not as a conqueror, but as a teacher, instructing the people in agriculture, architecture, and the cycles of time. Strikingly, in some accounts he promised one day to return, as though his exile was not complete. How curious it is that cultures an ocean apart, Egyptian and Mesoamerican, share echoes of visitors who brought sudden leaps in knowledge. Could these figures be the same memory wearing different masks? Survivors of Atlantis, remembered as gods? The survivors may not have traveled as armies, but as scattered families, priests, or explorers who found refuge along foreign shores. They would have carried what they could: seeds, tools, knowledge of the stars, and perhaps fragments of maps. These fragments could explain the sudden appearance of advanced cartography in later centuries, as well as the seemingly impossible alignment of ancient monuments with celestial events. Survivors, desperate to preserve what was lost, may have inscribed their wisdom into stone, myth, and ritual. What is haunting about this theory is the human element. Imagine being among the few who escaped. You watch your homeland vanish, its cities swallowed by the ocean. You carry not only grief but a responsibility to ensure that your people are not entirely forgotten. How would you pass on your knowledge? Through story, through symbols, through teaching. And if your descendants were not ready to grasp it fully, your knowledge will be remembered as myth, your existence elevated to godhood. The survivors, in time, would become legends. But survival is never simple. Refugees are often mistrusted, their memories doubted, their ways seen as alien. Some may have failed to preserve their knowledge, lost among hostile lands. Others may have been worshipped, their identities distorted until they became inseparable from divine myth. The Atlantean survivors, if they existed, may have suffered the greatest exile of all, to live while their home was gone, to wander across alien lands, always carrying the shadow of a drowned world. There is also the possibility that these survivors did not blend silently into history. What if they sought to rebuild Atlantis, not just in memory, but in form? Some theorists point to megalithic sites, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the pyramids of Egypt, the ruins of Tiwanaku in Bolivia, as attempts by survivors to recreate the grandeur of what was lost. These places appear suddenly in history, with architectural sophistication that seems to emerge fully formed. Did these monuments serve as anchors, reminders of a world erased, built by hands guided by memory? And so the emotional weight grows heavier. The story of Atlantean survivors is not only about a lost world, but about human resilience in the face of annihilation. To survive catastrophe is to carry the unbearable burden of memory. Perhaps this is why the legend of Atlantis has endured, because it is not only the story of a city swallowed by the sea, but of its people refusing to vanish from history. Through myth, maps, and monuments, they ensured that their voice would still be heard even across millennia. The survivors may be gone, their names erased, but the traces they left remain. Each map that shows more than it should, each myth that echoes across continents, each monument that defies explanation, all may be the testimony of a handful of people who refuse to surrender their world to the abyss. And so we are left with a haunting thought. What if every civilization owes a quiet debt to Atlantis, not as a city of gods, but as the endurance of its refugees? Survivors who carried light into the darkness of a broken world, ensuring humanity would rise again. Across the globe, stone monuments rise from the earth like frozen echoes of an ancient language. They stand in deserts, jungles, and high plateaus, defying time itself. Pyramids, temples, and megaliths, each carved with a precision that seems to mock the tools of their supposed age. To archaeologists, they are architectural marvels. To storytellers, they are whispers of the divine. But to those who seek the truth of Atlantis, they may be something more, the encrypted testimony of survivors, symbols in stone meant to carry messages across millennia. Consider the pyramids of Giza. These colossal structures, aligned with the stars of Orion's belt, appear not merely as tombs but as cosmic markers. Their proportions encode mathematical constants, such as pi and the golden ratio, knowledge far beyond the practical needs of ancient builders. Could these alignments and measurements be fragments of a lost science, preserved by people desperate to pass on their understanding of the cosmos? If survivors of Atlantis carried maps of the heavens, the pyramids may have been a way of anchoring those maps on Earth. Travel halfway across the world, and the same story unfolds in a different dialect. In Mesoamerica, the pyramids of Teotihuacan and the temple of Kukulkan echo similar alignments with celestial events. At Chichen Itza, the pyramid steps create the illusion of a serpent descending during the equinox, a living symbol carved in shadow and light. Was this simply religious spectacle, or a sophisticated message about cycles of time, preserved for future generations? Further south, the ruins of Tiwanaku in Bolivia bear carvings that hint at advanced astronomical knowledge. The Gateway of the Sun, a massive stone arch etched with enigmatic symbols, is thought to track celestial events. Scholars debate its meaning, but to some, it represents a fragment of a calendar system so advanced it suggests an inheritance from an older, forgotten source. Could this have been the work of survivors translating the memory of their lost homeland into stone and symbol? Even more enigmatic is Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, a site dating back over 11,000 years. Its massive stone pillars, arranged in circles, are adorned with carvings of animals, celestial symbols, and abstract shapes. Mainstream archaeology calls it the world's first temple. But its sophistication, at a time when humanity was supposedly still in the Stone Age, is staggering. Where did such knowledge come from? Some researchers argue that Göbekli Tepe encodes star maps, a celestial record preserved from an earlier epoch. If true, it could represent one of the earliest attempts by Atlantean survivors to ensure their knowledge endured after catastrophe. The recurrence of similar symbols is striking. The spiral, for example, appears across cultures, in Celtic carvings, Native American petroglyphs, and ancient Pacific art. The serpent, too, wins its way through mythologies on every continent, often linked to water, cycles, and wisdom. The same patterns, the same motifs, repeating across civilizations separated by oceans. Coincidence? Or the remnants of a symbolic language once shared by a global culture? What makes these symbols so powerful is that they transcend words. A story can be mistranslated, a language can vanish, but a carved image endures. Perhaps the survivors of Atlantis knew this. Perhaps they chose stone because it was eternal. Their temples and monuments would outlive empires, carrying their message silently until someone, someday, would notice the connections. But here lies the haunting part. What if we are not only noticing, but decoding? Modern researchers have begun to overlay star maps with ancient monuments, revealing alignments that seem deliberate. The Great Pyramid aligned to Orion, the Nazca lines pointing towards solstices and constellations, Stonehenge marking the summer solstice sunrise. When seen individually, they are impressive. When seen together, they resemble a global network of star maps etched into Earth itself, as though survivors of a cataclysm were reconstructing a shattered cosmology across continents. And yet, these symbols may carry warnings as well as wisdom. Some monuments speak of floods, fire, and cycles of destruction. The Mayan calendar, often misunderstood, was less about predicting apocalypse than about reminding humanity of the inevitability of cycles, creation, destruction, rebirth. Did the survivors, haunted by the fall of their own civilization, encode not just knowledge but caution? Were they trying to tell us, this has happened before, it can happen again? To walk among these stones is to feel both awe and unease. They are not dead relics but living messages, heavy with intent. Each carving, each alignment, feels like the touch of a hand reaching across time. If we listen closely, we may hear what those hands were trying to say. If we ignore them, we risk repeating the same mistakes. Perhaps this is a true legacy of Atlantis, not a physical city waiting to be uncovered, but a network of symbols in stone, scattered across the world, meant to remind us of who we were and who we might become again. Throughout history, whispers of secret brotherhoods and hidden orders have haunted the edges of mainstream civilization. They appear in stories of sages, priests, and keepers of wisdom, men and women who claim to guard ancient truths too dangerous for the world to know. To some, they were protectors. To others, they were conspirators. But what if their real purpose was far older than religion or politics? What if they were the heirs of Atlantean survivors, guardians tasked with preserving fragments of a lost civilization's knowledge until the world was ready to hear it again? Consider Egypt's priesthood. When the Greek philosopher Solon visited Sais, the priests that told him the story of Atlantis, a tale they said had been preserved in their temples for thousands of years. Why did they guard this memory so carefully? Why pass it down across generations, ensuring that it did not fade into myth? It was as though they were carrying the burden of history, safeguarding a truth that humanity could not afford to lose. In Greece, the idea of mystery schools flourished, hidden societies where initiates were taught secret knowledge through ritual and symbol. The Eleusinian mysteries, for example, promised not only enlightenment but a glimpse into truths about life, death, and the cosmos. Some researchers believe these schools were more than spiritual retreats. They may have been repositories of ancient wisdom, designed to protect and transmit the last fragments of Atlantean science, encoded in allegory so that only the worthy could understand. The pattern repeats across cultures. In Mesopotamia, scribes recorded flood myths on clay tablets, preserving them for millennia. In India, the Brahmins were entrusted with the Vedas, texts brimming with cosmic knowledge, sacred geometry, and references to cycles of destruction and rebirth. Among the Druids of Europe, oral tradition carried knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and nature, whispered in groves and megalithic circles far older than Rome. Everywhere we look, we see guardians, keepers of memory, protectors of maps, symbols, and stories too precious to leave unguarded. And then there are the secret societies of more recent times, the Knights Templar, the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons. Each cloaked themselves in symbols of antiquity, tracing their origins to ancient builders, sages, and hidden schools of wisdom. Though historians debate their claims, the symbolism embedded in their rituals often points back to the same themes: sacred geometry, lost knowledge, a golden age destroyed by catastrophe. Could it be that these groups were not inventing myths, but inheriting them, carrying forward fragments of Atlantean memory under new banners? If so, their secrecy begins to make sense. Knowledge is power, and the Guardians may have feared that the wisdom they held, cosmic cycles, advanced sciences, perhaps even technologies, could be dangerous in the wrong hands. By hiding their teachings in symbols, allegories, and coded rituals, they ensured survival without revealing everything. Only initiates, prepared by discipline and loyalty, could approach the deeper layers of truth. But there's another possibility, darker and more haunting. What if the Guardians were not only preserving knowledge, but also controlling it? What if their task was not merely to remember Atlantis, but to decide who deserved to inherit its legacy? Across history, the tension between secrecy and revelation has always been fraught. Some Guardians may have been true protectors, while others may have hoarded wisdom for power, creating hierarchies where knowledge was restricted to the chosen few. Emotionally, this raises an unsettling thought. If Atlantis was lost to cataclysm and its survivors became scattered, then the Guardians carried a heavy burden. They were entrusted not only with memory but with responsibility for humanity's future. Did they succeed in protecting us, or did they fail by keeping too much hidden? If humanity once fell because it misused knowledge, perhaps the Guardians feared the cycle repeating. But if they kept it hidden too long, perhaps they ensured humanity would stumble in ignorance. Even today, echoes of guardianship remain. Ancient manuscripts are locked away in private collections. Lost cities remain buried, their secrets unrevealed. Rumors of hidden libraries, such as the legendary Hall of Record beneath the Sphinx or the vanished Library of Alexandria, continue to spark curiosity. Are these only legends, or are they real vaults of forgotten wisdom, guarded until the time is right? To walk through history is to see shadows of the guardians everywhere, hidden orders, forgotten brotherhoods, ancient priesthoods, all carrying the same burden. They remind us that the past is not only about monuments and ruins, but about choices, what to reveal and what to conceal. And so, the question lingers, were the guardians protecting us from dangerous truths, or were they holding back the very wisdom that could prevent another fall? Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the knowledge of Atlantis is too vast, too heavy, to hand to humanity all at once. Perhaps it must be carried in fragments, released like sparks, until we are ready to bear the full fire. For ancient civilizations, the sky was never just a canvas of stars. It was a living map, a cosmic mirror reflecting the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. When we study the myths and monuments left behind by our ancestors, we find a striking pattern. Again and again, they aligned their temples, pyramids, and stone circles not by chance, but with careful precision to match the heavens. To them, the stars were not distant lights. They were guides, teachers, and perhaps reminders of a great catastrophe written into the cycles of time. Take the pyramids of Giza. Scholars have long debated why the three great pyramids are arranged the way they are, slightly offset from one another. Yet when mapped against the stars of Orion's belt, the alignment becomes clear. The Egyptians believed Orion was a celestial representation of Osiris, the god of resurrection and eternal life. Was this only myth, or was it a coded reminder that the origins of their civilization lay not in the desert sands, but in a connection to the stars themselves? Across the ocean, the Maya carved their calendars into stone with astonishing accuracy, tracking not only the solar year but cycles of Venus, eclipses, and even the slow precession of the equinoxes, a cycle spanning nearly 26,000 years. Why would a people living deep in the jungles of Central America track such immense spans of time? To them, time was not linear but cyclical, a wheel of creation and destruction. In their eyes, worlds had ended before and would end again. Their calendar was not just a way to measure days. It was a prophecy, warning that cosmic cycles govern the rise and fall of civilizations. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians etched star maps into clay tablets more than 5,000 years ago. Some show knowledge of celestial bodies that modern astronomers did not officially record until millennia later. How did they know? Did they inherit this knowledge from careful observation, or from a much older source, perhaps a remnant of Atlantean science? Stonehenge, too, was more than a circle of stones. Its builders aligned it with the solstices, marking the turning points of the year. To stand there at sunrise on the longest day is to feel the weight of an ancient intelligence, one that understood that the movements of the heavens were inseparable from the fate of humanity. Sites across the world, from Machu Picchu in Peru to Napa Playa in the Sahara, bear the same signature, alignments that tie earth to sky, as if every sacred site was built as part of a great, interconnected star map. But perhaps the most haunting example of all is Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, a temple complex dating back more than 11,000 years. Its pillars are etched with strange animals, symbols, and astronomical signs. Some researchers argue that its carvings record the memory of a comet strike around 10,900 BCE, the very event some scientists believe triggered the Younger Dryas, a mini ice age that devastated early humanity. If true, then Göbekli Tepe is not only the world's oldest temple. It is a warning carved in stone, a message from survivors who wanted the heavens to remind us of what had happened before. The emotional weight of this realization is profound. If ancient people went to such extraordinary lengths to align their monuments with the sky, it suggests that they believed their survival depended on it. The stars were not only spiritual symbols but markers of time, warning of repeating cycles. Perhaps Atlantis itself perished not in a random disaster, but in a cosmic event tied to these cycles, a strike from the heavens, a shift in the earth, a flood unleashed when the skies turned against the earth. This brings us to a chilling question. Were the ancients trying to tell us that what happened to them will happen again? The precession of the equinoxes, the alignments of Orion, The cycles tracked by the Maya all point toward vast cosmic rhythms. Rhythms so large they extend beyond the span of human lifetimes, but not beyond the span of civilizations. If Atlantis truly fell in such a cycle, then humanity's obsession with the stars becomes less about wonder and more about survival. Even modern science now echoes what ancient myths have whispered for thousands of years. We know that Earth passes through cosmic debris fields, that impact have scarred our planet many times, and that cycles of climate change are often linked to celestial forces. The ancients may not have had telescopes or satellites, but they had stories, monuments, and calendars, tools designed to remember what should never be forgotten. And yet, buried in their myths and symbols, there is also hope. For just as the stars mark destruction, they also mark rebirth. Orion was not only the god of death but of resurrection. The Maya spoke not only of endings but of new creations. The stars did not just doom humanity. They offered a path to renewal, if only their lessons were understood. To look up at the night sky as our ancestors did is to see more than beauty. It is to see a mirror of history itself, a cosmic clock ticking endlessly. And somewhere within its turning, perhaps, lies a memory of Atlantis, not as a place lost forever, but as a chapter in the story of the heavens. If one looks closely at the relics left by ancient civilizations, a pattern emerges, not of randomness, but of symbols that seem to repeat across continents, across cultures, across thousands of years. Spirals carved into stone in Ireland echo spirals found in the deserts of the American Southwest. Geometric patterns in the ruins of Central America resemble the same star motifs carved into temples in India. How could cultures so far apart, with no contact we can prove, leave behind the same marks? Was this mere coincidence? Or was there once a shared science, a symbolic language of the ancients that whispered of a hidden origin? Take, for example, the spiral. To modern eyes, it may appear as simple decoration, but to ancient minds, it was a very fingerprint of nature. The spiral is found in the Nautilus shell, in galaxies, in whirlpools, in hurricanes. It is the shape of growth, the pattern of energy unfolding. Ancient people may not have had microscopes or telescopes, but they watched nature with patient eyes. They saw the spiral in the sky, in the seas, in the smallest shell washed up on the shore. To carve the spiral was to capture the movement of life itself. Could it also have been a scientific record, a way of encoding knowledge about energy, time, or the turning of the heavens? Then there are the interlocking circles known today as a flower of life, found in temples across Egypt, Greece, and Asia. This design, perfectly geometric, endlessly repeating, seems almost too precise for primitive tools. Some researchers suggest it represents the mathematical patterns underlying reality, from the structure of atoms to the orbit of planets. The ancients may have encoded their understanding of harmony, proportion, and cosmic order into a symbol that survives even when words and records have been lost. If so, then we are not looking at simple decoration, but at fragments of a science so advanced it had to be hidden in plain sight. In the Americas, we see strange glyphs carved into stone, circles within circles, zigzags, and serpentine lines. At Chaco Canyon, an ancient sun dagger marks solstices and equinoxes with beams of light that pass through carved spirals. The people who built it were not random nomads. They were astronomers, engineers, and philosophers, encoding their observations of the sky into stone. The same zigzag serpent appears again and again in different cultures, from the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica to the cosmic serpent in Aboriginal Australian myth. Could this serpent represent more than myth? Lightning, rivers, or perhaps energy itself, something understood by those who came before us. Even in Egypt, the walls of Dendera temples show images that some interpret as giant light bulbs, while others argue they represent knowledge of electrical phenomena or the flow of energy. Whether or not such theories hold truth, what is undeniable is that the Egyptians filled their walls with symbols meant to carry meaning across time. Hieroglyphs were not just words, but sacred images, each one carrying layers of understanding, spiritual, practical, astronomical. And among them we find boats sailing through the sky, stars charted in detail, and cosmic beings whose forms echo constellations above. These repeating patterns may be the last whispers of a universal knowledge. Atlantis, if it existed, may not have spread armies or empires, but ideas so powerful they became myth, symbol, and sacred image across the globe. when the catastrophe came and the memory of Atlantis was buried beneath the waves. Perhaps its survivors carried fragments of that knowledge. They could not rebuild their machines or their temples overnight, but they could carve symbols, draw maps, and leave behind signs. To us, they may look like art. To them, they were survival manuals for the soul of humanity. Consider also the myth of the 7 sages. In Mesopotamia, these were the Apkallu, wise men sent by the gods after a great flood, bringing laws, writing, and agriculture. In India, there were the Saptarishi, 7 rishis who preserved knowledge through cycles of destruction and creation. In Greece, they became the 7 sages, guardians of wisdom in an age before history. Is it coincidence that so many traditions remember 7 teachers of knowledge, all connected to the stars of the constellation we call the Pleiades? Or is it memory of a shared origin, a group of survivors carrying fragments of Atlantean science in symbolic form? When we trace these symbols across time, the emotional weight deepens. They remind us that human beings, even in their most primitive states, were never simple. They were dreamers, observers, scientists in their own way. They saw the world as alive with meaning, and they recorded that meaning in the only way they could, through symbol. Every spiral, every serpent, every star carved into stone is a voice from the past saying, "We saw something. We knew something. Do not forget." And so, as we walk through ruins and gaze at the strange markings left behind, we must ask ourselves, are these merely the echoes of superstition, or are they fragments of a lost science, a science born of Atlantis? If so, then perhaps the ancients have not been silent. Perhaps they have been speaking to us all along, waiting for us to relearn the language of symbols. Every great civilization leaves behind not just ruins, but a story. Rome left its law, Greece its philosophy, Egypt its monuments. But Atlantis, if it truly existed, left behind something far more elusive. Not physical ruins, but echoes in the DNA of culture itself. The idea that a civilization of staggering power and knowledge could vanish, yet still ripple through myth, architecture, and philosophy, is at once haunting and inspiring. For what is legacy, if not the ability to survive beyond death, beyond disaster, beyond even the memory of one's name? In the dialogues of Plato, Atlantis appears not as a myth, but as a moral warning. A civilization blessed with divine gift became corrupted by greed, its arrogance leading to its downfall. Yet in the same story lies the seed of something more, the suggestion that Atlantis was not erased completely, that fragments of its culture seeped into Egypt, into Greece, and beyond. The priests who told Solon the story may have believed themselves heirs to a forgotten age. In their temples, knowledge was preserved like embers carried from a dying fire, waiting to ignite again. Look to the engineering marvels of the ancient world, pyramids, megaliths, aqueducts carved with impossible precision, and one cannot help but wonder if these were not entirely the inventions of their builders, but refinements of something older. Survivors of Atlantis, scattered across the world, may have whispered to new peoples of lost techniques, of cosmic alignments, of the balance between man and nature. They could not rebuild their drowned cities, but they could plant seeds. And those seeds became civilizations. The Atlantean legacy is also moral. Again and again, myths warn us of the dangers of pride, of forgetting our place within the great cycles of the earth and sky. The flood myths are not just about water. They are about cleansing, about renewal after humanity's hubris. Perhaps those who remembered Atlantis wanted us to never forget that no power, no empire, no mastery over nature can save us from collapse if we turn against balance. The story of Atlantis was not only a lament, it was a lesson. And yet, it is also possible that Atlantis left behind a more tangible legacy, maps, symbols, even scientific principles disguised as myth. The recurring star alignments, the obsession with cycles of time, the use of sacred geometry, all point to a worldview that is strikingly consistent across distant cultures. Was this shared by chance? Or was it inherited, a memory passed down in secret through priesthoods, mystery schools, and secret orders? The Hermetic teachings of Egypt, the Pythagorean mysteries of Greece, even the esoteric traditions of the Middle Ages all echo the same theme, that knowledge is eternal, and that it must be guarded until the world is ready to understand. Imagine for a moment that Atlantis was not just a physical place, but also an idea, a symbol of the highest potential of humanity when wisdom and power are united. If so, then the true Atlantean legacy is not in lost stones or drowned temples, but in us, in our yearning to seek, to build, to push beyond the boundaries of the known, in our fear of repeating the mistakes of arrogance, but also in our hope that one day humanity may rise to that level of greatness again, without falling. There is an emotional pull in this vision, because to believe in Atlantis is, in some sense, to believe in ourselves, to believe that we are capable of both great destruction and great creation, that we are heirs to a forgotten chapter of history, one that still whispers through myth and symbol, urging us to remember. The Atlantean legacy, then, is both a warning and a promise that if we forget balance, we will fall. But if we remember, we may yet build something even greater. And perhaps, just perhaps, this is why the story has endured. For more than 2 millennia, thinkers, explorers, and dreamers have returned to Atlantis. They have searched the seas, dug through ruins, pored over maps. Some have been dismissed as fools. Others have been hailed as visionaries. But all of them, in their obsession, have kept the story alive. And so, Atlantis survives, not as a city of stone, but as a city of the mind, an eternal idea that refuses to die. So as we close in on the final threads of this mystery, we must ask, if Atlantis' legacy, not ruin, then what is it telling us now? Perhaps the final secret of Atlantis is not where it lies, but why we cannot forget it. Perhaps its true gift is reflection, a mirror held up to humanity, showing both our greatest heights and our darkest falls. And in that mirror, the question remains, will we repeat the cycle or break it? Throughout this journey, we have sifted through myths, maps, symbols, and ruins, chasing shadows of a civilization that may have once stood as humanity's greatest triumph and greatest tragedy. Now, at the edge of the story, we face the final revelation. Atlantis may never have been meant to be found as a city of stone. Instead, it may have always been a lesson, a hidden key embedded in the very fabric of human memory, guiding us, warning us, daring us to see beyond the surface of history. When Plato first recorded the story, he did not present it as idle fantasy. He wrote with the gravity of a philosopher, warning that civilizations rise and fall according to their virtue. To him, Atlantis was not simply a lost kingdom. It was a mirror, a reminder that power without wisdom leads to ruin. Whether Atlantis was real in stone or not, the truth of its story has proven itself again and again in human history. Rome, Egypt, the Maya, countless empires, all rose in brilliance, all fell into dust. The story of Atlantis is the story of us. And yet, there's another layer. The maps that hint at ancient knowledge of coastlines before the Ice Age. The symbols that repeat across continents as if echoing a shared memory. The myths of floods, sages, and stars that appear in cultures separated by oceans. These fragments do not vanish when dismissed as coincidence. Instead, they build a case, not of Atlantis as a city we can excavate, but as a truth we can feel. A memory of something older, something vast, something humanity once knew and then lost. Perhaps this is why Atlantis refuses to die in our imagination, because it is more than myth, more than history. It is archetype. It is the eternal story of human ambition and human fragility. Every time we look at the ruins of fallen civilizations, every time we wonder whether our own modern world will endure, we are living the question of Atlantis. Will we too drown in the flood of our own arrogance? Or will we learn, at last, the lesson carved into me thousands of years ago? The final revelation, then, is not where Atlantis lies, but where it lives. It lives in the midst of our ancestors, in the stones aligned with stars, in the symbols etched into temples, in the words of philosophers, and in the unshakable sense that history is deeper, stranger, and more cyclical than we dare admit. It lives in us, in our curiosity, in our longing to know where we came from and what destiny awaits us. And perhaps this is a true hidden map, not one drawn on parchment, but one etched into the human soul. A map that points not to a place, but to a choice, to remember or to forget, to rise with wisdom or to fall in pride, to treat Atlantis not as a riddle to be solved, but as a warning to be heeded. As the waves of time crash endlessly against the shores of history, the memory of Atlantis remains, not drowned, not silent, but waiting, waiting for us to see, waiting for us to understand, waiting for us to decide whether its fate will also be our own. And so, The question that lingers as a curtain falls is not where was Atlantis, but what will we do with its legacy? As we step back from the ruins, the maps, and the myths, the story of Atlantis begins to take on a new form, not as a city lost beneath the waves, but as an echo reverberating through time. Its influence is subtle yet undeniable, woven into the myths, monuments, and knowledge of civilizations across the globe. The echoes are everywhere, in the alignment of pyramids, the cycles of calendars, the symbols carved into stone, and the moral lessons embedded in ancient tales. Atlantis, in this sense, never truly disappeared. It became a guiding presence, shaping human history in ways both visible and invisible. Consider the enduring fascination with lost knowledge. From the Hermetic writings of Egypt to the Renaissance philosophers who rediscovered ancient texts, the search for truth has always been entwined with the idea that some wisdom has been deliberately hidden. The legacy of Atlantis, carried by survivors, priests, and secret societies, may be less about the specifics of its geography and more about the principles it left behind: balance, foresight, respect for nature, and the pursuit of knowledge tempered by humility. In this way, the Atlantean influence continues to steer humanity, whispering from the shadows of time. Even today, explorers, scientists, and historians are drawn to the same mysteries. They scan the oceans for lost continents, study ancient maps for impossible coastlines, and decipher symbols that seem to repeat across continents. This quest is more than academic. It is emotional, almost instinctual. The story of Atlantis taps into something deep within us, the need to understand where we come from, to connect with a civilization that reached for greatness, and to learn from its downfall. Its echo is a reminder that knowledge, once gained, can never be entirely lost if we are willing to listen. The emotional resonance of Atlantis lies in its dual nature. It is both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. The story warns of the dangers of hubris, of technological and moral overreach, and of ignoring the cycles of the natural world. But it also inspires, showing that human ingenuity, courage, and wisdom are capable of extraordinary feats. The civilizations that followed, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and beyond, may have inherited more than myths. They may have inherited a blueprint, a set of principles, or even fragments of technology and knowledge from a vanished world. Look closely at the symbols and monuments, and the emotional weight deepens. The spirals, serpents, and geometric carvings that echo across continents are not merely decorative. They are records of observation, memory, and warning. They speak to us in a language that transcends time, urging us to recognize the patterns that repeat in human history. They are Atlantean footprints, subtle yet persistent, challenging us to decipher their meaning. And in this challenge lies hope. Because if the echoes of Atlantis can survive millennia of upheaval, if they can whisper across oceans and deserts, then humanity itself has a potential to endure. The message is clear. Knowledge must be preserved, wisdom must be applied, and history must be remembered. In the cycles of rise and fall, the echoes of Atlantis remind us that we are not powerless. We are capable of learning, of adapting, and of rising anew, wiser than before. As we conclude this journey, the emotional payoff is both humbling and exhilarating. Atlantis is not just a lost city. It is a mirror reflecting our own potential and our own vulnerabilities. It reminds us that greatness comes with responsibility, that survival depends on balance, and that the echoes of the past are always present, guiding those willing to listen. The final thought lingers like the last note of symphony. What if the hidden maps, the symbols, and the wisdom of Atlantis are still guiding us today? What if every alignment of stone and star, every myth of flood and survival, is part of a message waiting for us to understand? The echoes across time are not silent. They are a call to reflection, urging humanity to heed the lessons of a civilization that dared to reach for the stars only to vanish beneath the waves. And as we look up at the night sky, tracing the constellations that inspired ancient builders and storytellers, one truth becomes clear. Atlantis may be gone, but its voice endures. In the myths, the maps, the symbols, and the echoes that reverberate through history, it challenges us to remember, to learn, and to rise, to write our own story with wisdom, courage, and humility, so that our legacy may endure across the ages, just as theirs has. This completes the cinematic journey, leaving the audience with a reflection and a subtle, haunting question. What if the secret of Atlantis is not beneath the ocean, but within us all?